Hello guys, today you're going to discover something you were probably never told about Christmas. The truth behind the figures that accompanied St. Nicholas through European villages, creating a balance between reward and responsibility. We'll explore Krampus, Zwarte Piet, Belsnickel, and other traditions that reveal a forgotten and fascinating side of Christmas celebrations. If you stay until the end, you'll understand why these figures may say more about human nature and cultural evolution than any commercial version of Christmas has ever revealed. So settle into a comfortable position, turn off the lights, and let this nocturnal journey through European winter traditions accompany you as you relax and reflect on what it truly means to celebrate light amid darkness. Have you ever stopped to think why so many cultures felt the need to create contrasting figures to accompany their saints? Why did generosity need a counterpoint that represented consequences? And what do these dual traditions tell us about how different societies approach education, morality, and the transmission of values across generations? These aren't empty rhetorical questions. They echo through centuries of European traditions that to this day keep alive practices that would make any modern marketing professional completely rethink their strategy. While in the United States, Christmas has become synonymous with universal celebration, shining sleighs, and exclusively positive figures in commercial decorations, much of Europe still celebrates, or at least remembers, when St. Nicholas didn't come alone. He brought company that represented the other side of the moral coin. In Austria, Germany, and parts of Switzerland, communities still preserve traditions where St. Nicholas is accompanied by Krampus, a figure from Alpine folklore represented as an anthropomorphic creature with goat-like characteristics, horns, dark fur, and chains. The tradition establishes that while St. Nicholas rewards positive behaviors with gifts, Krampus represents the consequences of negative actions, not through actual violence, but through the powerful symbolism of a presence that personifies personal responsibility. This isn't obscure folklore forgotten in historical archives. In December, Alpine towns still hold the Krampuslauf, Krampus parades, where participants wear elaborate carved wooden masks, traditional costumes, and perform through the streets in celebrations that blend theatre, folk art, and cultural preservation. The sound of bells and ceremonial chains mixes with traditional music. Entire families attend, tourists photograph, and everyone somehow feels they're participating in something much older and more significant than they fully understand. The experience is visceral, immersive, and completely different from any American Christmas celebration. There's nothing sanitized or commercially safe about it. It's living culture, breathing through the centuries, refusing to be domesticated by modernity. But Krampus isn't alone in this pantheon of symbolic helpers. In the Netherlands and Belgium, Sinterklaas, the historical figure who inspired the American Santa Claus, traditionally arrived accompanied by helpers, known collectively as his assistants. The representation of these figures evolved significantly over the decades, especially from the 19th century when the tradition was formalized in children's literature. During the 20th century, the characterization of these helpers became the object of intense cultural and social debate in the Netherlands. Historians point out that traditional representations reflected colonial attitudes and contexts of the era when they were established, when Holland maintained colonial territories and had recently ended slavery practices. In the last 2 decades, this aspect of the tradition has generated profound national discussions about cultural heritage, collective memory, and how modern societies should deal with historical elements that don't align with contemporary values of equality and respect. The Dutch debate about this tradition is fascinating because it reveals universal tensions. How do we balance personal nostalgia with social responsibility? When does cultural preservation become justification for maintaining questionable practices? Who decides which traditions deserve to be preserved and which should evolve? These questions don't have easy answers, and different communities in the Netherlands have reached different conclusions, with some cities completely reformulating the tradition, while others resist changes. Here's a question worth reflecting on. How many of our most cherished traditions carry within them layers of meaning that, under deeper analysis, reveal complexities we'd prefer not to examine? Crossing the Atlantic to the German-American communities of Pennsylvania, we find Belsnickel, a figure that German immigrants brought in the 18th century and that still appears in celebrations of some rural communities. Belsnickel is traditionally described as a man dressed in furs and rustic clothes, face-covered, sometimes wearing handcrafted wooden masks, carrying a symbolic switch. The tradition established that he would visit homes days before Christmas, asking children questions about their behavior during the year. The interaction was theatrical and educational. Children who answered honestly about their mistakes and demonstrated understanding of responsibility received small gifts, nuts, dried fruits, simple candies. Those who tried to deceive or didn't demonstrate reflection on their actions received nothing, or received only a symbolic twig as a reminder that actions have consequences. The Belsnickel tradition reveals something fascinating about how immigrant communities maintain cultural identity in foreign lands. While America around them adopted an increasingly commercialized and universalized version of Christmas, these German-American communities preserved a figure that their neighbors considered strange or antiquated. Belsnickel wasn't commercially viable, didn't fit in advertising campaigns, didn't translate easily to the dominant culture, and precisely because of that, he mattered. He was an anchor of authenticity in an ocean of cultural assimilation. These communities understood something profound. Traditions aren't just about what you do, but about who you are. Abandoning Belsnickel wouldn't just be changing a celebration, it would be losing a thread that connected generations, that linked families in rural Pennsylvania with ancestors in German villages they would never know. But why do these dual figures exist in the first place? Why did cultures separated by hundreds of kilometers, speaking different languages, independently develop the same basic narrative structure? A kind saint accompanied by a figure representing consequences. The answer lies in deep cultural roots that predate organized Christianity. Long before St. Nicholas became the patron of children in the 4th century, Germanic, Alpine, and Nordic peoples celebrated the winter solstice with rituals that recognized the fundamental duality of existence. Winter wasn't just a season, it was an existential test of survival. Families that hadn't prepared adequately would face hunger. Communities that didn't cooperate wouldn't survive. Individuals who made imprudent decisions put everyone at risk. In this context, figures that personified consequences made perfect sense. They weren't theological abstractions about sin and redemption, they were visceral representations that the world operated according to laws of cause and effect, and that protection wasn't guaranteed, but earned, through preparation, cooperation, and responsible behavior. When Christianity spread through Central and Northern Europe between the 4th and 10th centuries, instead of completely eliminating these pre-Christian figures and traditions, the Church often adopted a strategy of incorporation and transformation. Saint Nicholas, the kind bishop of Myra, who lived in the 4th century in present-day Turkey and was known for his anonymous generosity, was strategically positioned as the luminous counterpoint to figures from local traditions. The message was sophisticated: accept Christian teachings and you'll have the protection of kind saints. But the ancient forces, now reinterpreted not as pagan gods but as representations of moral consequences, still existed as reminders that free will comes with responsibility. This fusion of Christianity with local traditions created something unique, a layered belief system where the sacred and the secular, the rewarding and the consequential, coexisted not in opposition, but in functional partnership. St. Nicholas needed his counterpoint as much as the counterpoint needed St. Nicholas. One without the other was incomplete, unbalanced. And this leads us to a fascinating reflection on our own time and cultural context. In the United States, particularly from the 20th century onward, Christmas was progressively transformed into a universally positive celebration. The modern Santa Claus, derived from St. Nicholas but fundamentally reimagined, has no counterpoint. He is universally kind, universally generous, universally safe. Even the famous naughty and nice list has become more cultural joke than real threat. Everyone knows that practically all children will receive gifts anyway. This transformation wasn't accidental. It was the result of commercial forces, changes in child education theories, and the American desire to create a unified national identity that transcended the diverse ethnic traditions brought by immigrants. American Christmas needed to be accessible to everyone, offensive to no one, and above all, conducive to mass consumption. The result is a celebration remarkably different from those that still exist in parts of Europe. There's no ambiguity, there's no tension, there's no element of real consequence. It's light without shadow, sweetness without bitterness, reward without the possibility of its absence. Could it be that in creating this perfectly positive version, we also lost something essential about how we transmit values of responsibility, cause and effect, and the reality that the world contains both light and darkness? Think about the experience of a modern American child during Christmas. Every commercial surface is covered with bright decorations. Every song transmits unconditional joy. Every advertising message promises happiness through consumption. The narrative is monolithic. Christmas is good, gifts are guaranteed, and everything will end happily. Compare this with a child in an Alpine village who participates in a Krampus lauf, or a Dutch child who learns about Sinterklaas and his helpers with all the historical complexities that involves, or a child in a German-American community who receives a visit from Belsnickel and must honestly reflect on their behavior from the year. Which experience offers more complete preparation for the reality of a world that contains both kindness and challenge, both reward and consequence, both light and shadow? I'm not suggesting we should import European traditions intact into the American context. Cultural context matters, and what works in one society may not work in another. But there's value in examining what was lost in translation, what was left behind when Christmas crossed the Atlantic and was reshaped to serve commercial and national unification purposes. If you're enjoying this journey through European winter traditions and want to continue exploring how different cultures approach celebration, morality, and transmission of values, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps our community grow, and you'll receive notifications whenever we publish new stories. And leave a comment saying where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's genuinely fascinating for us to know where our community is spread around the world. We've already had viewers from more than 60 different countries, and each comment reminds us that stories connect people across borders that normally separate us. The dual figures of European Christmas also teach us something profound about the nature of moral authority and meaning. St. Nicholas, however kind he was, derived part of his impact from the fact that an alternative existed. His generosity meant more because it wasn't the only possibility. He wasn't just good, he represented the choice of good in a system where the opposite also existed. This dynamic reveals a psychological truth that modern behavioral economics researchers have rediscovered. We value more what we know we can lose. Rewards given unconditionally without possibility of variation based on behavior lose meaning over time. They become expectation, then assumed right, then insufficient to generate satisfaction. How many modern American families find themselves in this trap during the holiday season, giving more and more gifts, spending more and more money, and discovering that joy and gratitude don't increase proportionally, and sometimes even decrease. Children don't become happier with more gifts. They often become more bored, harder to satisfy, more focused on volume than on meaning. Perhaps the European traditions that maintained the element of duality were preserving not just folklore, but profound psychological wisdom about how meaning is created and maintained. But these traditions don't exist in static, historical vacuum. They evolved, were contested, were defended, were modified, and in some cases were abandoned. And the reasons for each of these changes tell us as much about the values of each era as the original traditions themselves. The contemporary debate in the Netherlands about how to represent Sinterklaas's helpers, for example, isn't just about a specific tradition. It's about how democratic societies negotiate cultural change, how they balance respect for heritage with commitment to equality, how different groups within a nation find ways to coexist when they have different values and priorities. There's no simple solution that satisfies everyone. And perhaps that's precisely the lesson. Living traditions are those that can be discussed, questioned, modified. Traditions that become untouchable and immune to reflection aren't cultural preservation. They're museums. Similarly, German-American communities that maintain Belsnickel don't do so exactly the same way their ancestors did in the 18th century. The tradition evolved, adapted, incorporated new elements while maintaining the essential core. This isn't betrayal of tradition, it's how traditions remain relevant across generations. And Krampus? In the last 2 decades, the figure has experienced a surprising resurgence, not just in the Alps, but internationally. Films, documentaries, themed festivals, even in the United States. Part of this is pure curiosity about the exotic, but part may be something deeper, a recognition that the perfectly sanitized version of Christmas left a void, a hunger for something more authentic, more complex, more honest about human nature. So, as you settle more deeply into your pillow tonight, consider, what do our celebrations say about our values? When we remove all elements of tension, consequence, and duality from our traditions, what do we gain in comfort, and what do we lose in meaning? Is there a path between the extreme of genuinely terrifying figures and the extreme of positivity so universal it becomes empty? And what if the answers to some of the most difficult questions about how to transmit values, create meaning, and prepare the next generation for a complex world are hidden, not in the latest psychological studies, but in alpine villages where centuries-old traditions are still lived, discussed, and slowly transformed by each generation that inherits them? These questions will accompany us as we explore more deeply the historical origins of these figures, discovering that their roots plunge into layers of human culture much older than Christianity, much deeper than any Christmas tradition, touching on something fundamental about how we create order, meaning, and community in a world that offers no guarantees. Before St. Nicholas became the patron saint of children, before Christianity redrew the spiritual map of Europe, before even Rome extended its empire beyond the Alps, the Germanic, Celtic, and Norse peoples already celebrated the winter solstice with rituals that acknowledged a fundamental truth. Darkness is not merely the absence of light, but a force with its own presence. To understand Krampus, Perchta, the Icelandic Yule Lads, and dozens of other figures that still haunt European winter celebrations, we need to go back much further than the 4th century when St. Nicholas lived. We need to return to a time when the forests of Central Europe were vast and impenetrable, when winter killed a significant percentage of the population each year, and when survival depended not on technology or global trade, but on communal preparation and respect for forces that humans could not control. Have you ever wondered why so many ancient cultures personified the seasons as living beings? Why wasn't it enough to simply observe that days grew shorter and weather colder? Why the need to create narratives, rituals, mythical figures that embodied these changes? The answer lies in how the human mind processes existential threats. When we face forces completely beyond our control, the movement of celestial bodies, the changing of seasons, the arrival of deadly winter. Our psyche seeks ways to create some sense of agency, some illusion of negotiating with the inevitable. If winter is just weather, there's nothing we can do, but if winter is a force, a spirit, an entity with its own will, then perhaps we can appease it, negotiate with it, survive it through correct behavior. The pre-Christian Germanic peoples celebrated Yule, a winter solstice festival lasting 12 days that marked the darkest point of the year, when the sun seemed to be dying and needed to be ritually persuaded to return. It wasn't a joyful celebration in the modern sense. It was a negotiation with cosmic forces, an acknowledgement of human vulnerability, and a reaffirmation of communal bonds that would be tested in the cold months ahead. During Yule, it was believed that the wild hunt crossed the skies. A ghostly procession led by Odin, or Wotan, depending on the region, where spirits of the dead, supernatural creatures and chaotic forces rode through the longest nights. Sensible people stayed indoors. Those foolish enough to venture out could be swept up by the hunt, lost forever between the worlds of the living and the dead. This wasn't childish superstition. It was a sophisticated metaphor for real dangers, temperatures that killed in hours, snowstorms that disoriented travelers mere feet from safety, the madness that winter isolation could induce, the danger of resource exhaustion. The wild hunt was all these threats personified in a narrative that made them understandable, memorable, transmissible across generations. And here's something fascinating. When Christianity arrived, it didn't eliminate the wild hunt. It couldn't. The belief was too deeply rooted, too connected to the lived realities of Alpine and Nordic winter. So instead, the church reinterpreted it. Odin was replaced by various figures. Sometimes King Herod pursuing the innocents, sometimes souls in purgatory, sometimes demons punishing sinners. The narrative structure remained, only the characters were renamed. Krampus emerges directly from this tradition. His name probably derives from Krampen, the German word for claw, or possibly from Krampen, meaning something withered or dried, a reference to the birch rods he traditionally carries. But his roots are much older than his Christian name. Before being St. Nicholas's diabolic helper, Krampus was probably one of many creatures associated with the wild hunt, or perhaps a manifestation of nature spirits that Alpine peoples believed inhabited the mountains and forests. These entities weren't malevolent in the Christian sense. They weren't trying to steal souls for hell. They were simply indifferent to human welfare, operating according to their own laws, and dangerous to those who didn't respect them. Krampus's transformation from nature spirit to St. Nicholas's helper represents one of the medieval church's most intelligent strategies: co-optation through subordination. The figure couldn't be eliminated, so it was incorporated, but in a position subordinate to Christian authority. Krampus maintained his power to frighten, but now that power served the church's purposes, reinforcing moral behavior as defined by Christian doctrine. But Krampus wasn't alone in this pantheon of transformed winter figures. In Austria and Bavaria, traditions speak of Frau Perchta, sometimes called Perchta or Bertha, a female figure associated with the period between Christmas and Epiphany, known as the 12 Nights. Perchta had two faces. For those who had worked hard during the year, spun their flax, kept their homes in order, she brought blessings and prosperity. For the lazy, the dishonest, those who violated food taboos during sacred days, she brought punishment. The stories about Perchta are remarkably specific and visceral. She supposedly opened the bellies of the lazy and filled them with straw and stones. This grotesque image wasn't gratuitous. It was a powerful metaphor about the cost of laziness in an agricultural society where winter survival literally depended on how much work you'd done during summer and fall. Someone who hadn't adequately prepared didn't just suffer, they put the entire community at risk, since communities shared resources in times of scarcity. Perchta was also associated with spinning, a crucial activity for winter survival, since adequate clothing meant the difference between life and death. Women who hadn't spun their quota of linen during the year were especially targets of her wrath. Again, this wasn't arbitrary cruelty, it was a narrative that reinforced behaviors essential for communal survival. What's remarkable about Perchta is that she survived Christianization with much of her pre-Christian character intact. The Church tried to transform her into various saints, Saint Bertha, for example, but people maintained the older, darker stories more connected to the agricultural realities of their lives. In some regions, she was demonized as a witch. In others, she maintained an ambiguous status, neither completely good nor completely evil, but a force of nature that rewarded and punished according to laws older than Christianity. Traveling north to Iceland, we find the Jólasveinar, the Yule Lads, 13 figures who descend from the mountains one by one during the 13 nights before Christmas. Unlike Krampus or Perchta, the Yule Lads began as genuinely threatening figures in medieval Icelandic folklore. They weren't helpers to anyone. They were trolls or mountain creatures who came to isolated farms during the darkest winter, each with a disturbing specialty. Their names reveal their natures: Stekkjarstaur, sheepcoat clod; Giljagour, gullygawk; Stufur, stubby; the Vöruslækir, spoonlicker; Pottaskafil, pot scraper; Askaslækir, bowl licker; Hurdaskellir, door slammer; Skyrgamor, skier gobbler; Bjugnakrækir, sausage swiper; Gluggageygir, window peeper; Gatathafor, doorway sniffer; Kettkrókur, meat hook; and Kertasníkir, candle stealer. Each name describes a specific transgression or disturbing behavior. And here's what's fascinating. These transgressions are all related to scarce resources during the Icelandic winter: food, light, heat, domestic animals. The Yule Lads personified all the ways a medieval Icelandic family could lose the resources they needed to survive winter. But over the centuries, something remarkable happened. The Yule Lads were progressively domesticated. In the 20th century, especially after Iceland's independence from Denmark in 1944, there was a conscious effort to create distinctly Icelandic national traditions. The Yule Lads were transformed from genuine threats into figures more mischievous than frightening, eventually becoming gift-givers, each leaving a small present in shoes that children place in windows during the 13 nights before Christmas. This transformation of the Yule Lads perfectly illustrates how traditions evolve in response to changes in material conditions and social needs. When Iceland was an isolated agricultural society where winter was a genuine existential threat, the Yule Lads served as narrative reminders of vulnerability and the need for vigilance. When Iceland modernized, gained independence, and winter ceased to be potentially deadly for most people, the same figures were reinterpreted to serve new purposes: national identity, children's entertainment, cultural tourism. This raises a provocative question. Do traditions have essential and immutable meanings, or are they empty vessels that each generation fills with its own values and needs? Consider how different generations of Icelanders experienced the Yule Lads. For a medieval farmer on an isolated farm, surrounded by darkness 20 hours a day, with provisions that needed to last until distant spring, the stories of the Yule Lads were practical warnings disguised as folklore. For a modern Icelandic child in Reykjavik, with central heating, supermarkets open year-round, and high-speed internet, the same Yule Lads are amusing figures who bring small gifts and chocolate. Same tradition, completely different meanings, and both are authentic within their contexts. This fluidity of meaning is crucial to understanding why some traditions survive while others disappear. Traditions that can be reinterpreted, that have sufficient narrative flexibility, to serve different needs in different times persist. Traditions too rigid, too specific to contexts that no longer exist, disappear or become historical curiosities artificially maintained by enthusiasts. But there's a danger in this fluidity too. When a tradition becomes so flexible it can mean anything, it risks meaning nothing. When the Yule Lads become just cute marketing characters, when Krampus becomes just a Halloween costume, when Perchta is reduced to a generic witch in horror stories, something essential is lost: the connection to the lived realities that gave rise to these figures in the first place. So how do we find the balance? How do we keep traditions alive and relevant without completely disconnecting them from their roots and original meanings? Perhaps the answer lies in recognizing that traditions are not static objects to be preserved in museums, but living processes of cultural transmission. Each generation doesn't inherit ready-made traditions. It inherits narrative raw material that must be actively reinterpreted and reconstructed to make sense in its own context. The Alpine peoples who maintain the Krampuslauf today aren't simply repeating medieval rituals, they're actively deciding that this tradition still has value, still communicates something important about communal identity, about the importance of balancing light and shadow, about maintaining connection with the past while living in the present. Each carved mask, each constructed costume, each street performance is an act of creation as much as preservation. And this brings us back to the questions we started with. Why did so many cultures create figures that balanced benevolent saints with dark counterpoints? Why does this dual structure appear independently in so many different places? Perhaps because it reflects something fundamental about human experience that transcends specific culture. Life contains both joy and suffering, both reward and consequence, both light and darkness. Traditions that acknowledge only one side of this duality are, at some fundamental level, dishonest. They don't prepare people for the complete reality of existence. The dark figures of European winter, Krampus, Perchta, the Yule Lads, and dozens of others, didn't exist to traumatize children. They existed to transmit truths about the world that were difficult to communicate otherwise, that actions have consequences, that preparation matters, that community survives through cooperation and shared responsibility, that the world contains forces indifferent to human welfare, and that safety is not guaranteed, but earned through vigilance and work. These lessons were literally matters of life or death in pre-industrial societies. Today, in most of the developed world, they're no longer so. Winter no longer kills people in significant numbers. Hunger is rare. Most children will survive to adulthood regardless of how well they behave. So have these traditions lost all relevance? Or do they communicate psychological and social truths that remain important even when the specific physical threats that inspired them have disappeared? Consider what Krampus really represents when stripped of his specific winter survival context. He represents the idea that not everyone deserves reward, that behavior matters, that there are consequences for actions, that protection and safety are not automatic rights, but must be earned through correct choices. Are these ideas less relevant today than they were in 1500? Or are they perhaps even more important in a culture that often seems to have forgotten that consequences exist? As you reflect on these questions, letting them circulate in your mind as sleep approaches, consider also this. The pagan roots of these traditions don't make them less valuable or less true. They simply connect them to a deeper stratum of human experience, to a time when people lived closer to the natural forces that still govern our existence, even though we now experience them through layers of technology and material comfort. And perhaps there's wisdom in these ancient layers that our modern age, with all its technological sophistication, has forgotten or prematurely discarded. Wisdom about balance, about duality, about the need to acknowledge both light and shadow if we want to live fully and honestly. But these figures didn't remain frozen in their pagan forms. Christianity transformed them, and these transformations reveal as much about the nature of religious and cultural change as the original figures themselves. When Christianity began to spread through Central and Northern Europe, missionaries and church leaders faced a dilemma that would define centuries of religious practice: how to convert entire populations whose beliefs, rituals, and narrative structures were deeply rooted in traditions that preceded Christianity by millennia. The answer the Church developed was remarkably sophisticated and in many respects pragmatic. Instead of trying to completely eradicate existing beliefs, a strategy that had repeatedly failed and generated violent resistance, the Church adopted an approach of incorporation and transformation. Pagan figures weren't eliminated, they were reinterpreted within a Christian framework. Festivals weren't prohibited, they were rededicated to Christian saints. Sacred sites weren't destroyed, they were converted into churches. This strategy is often called religious syncretism, and its evidence is everywhere in Europe if you know where to look. Churches built over ancient pagan worship sites, Christian saints whose stories suspiciously mirror those of earlier gods, Christian festivals that coincide perfectly with pre-Christian seasonal celebrations, and, relevant to our story, pagan folkloric figures who were transformed into helpers, adversaries, or subordinates of Christian saints. But here's a question worth contemplation. When you transform a pagan figure into a Christian figure, what exactly survives? Is it the same entity with a new name, or has something fundamentally different been created? And who decides? The religious authority imposing the new interpretation, or the common people who continue telling the stories in their own way? St. Nicholas, the Bishop of Myra, who lived in the 4th century, became one of the most important figures in this strategy of Christianizing winter traditions. The historical Nicholas was known for his generosity, particularly toward children and the poor. The most famous story about him involves secretly providing dowries for 3 poor young women, throwing bags of gold through the window, or, in some versions, down the chimney, to save the family from destitution. This story of anonymous generosity provided the perfect narrative foundation for transforming Nicholas into a gift-giving figure associated with winter celebrations. But the real genius came when the Church began positioning St. Nicholas as the Christian counterpoint to the dark figures that already existed in popular traditions. The message was clear and powerful: accept Christianity, venerate the saints, and you'll have protection against dark forces. Reject it, and, well, those ancient figures your ancestors feared are still there, waiting. Krampus is the clearest example of this transformation. In his pre-Christian form, he was probably a nature spirit or a creature associated with the wild hunt. Powerful, dangerous, but not particularly interested in human morality as defined by any religion. He operated according to his own laws, representing the chaotic and indifferent forces of winter nature. But in the Christian narrative that developed during the Middle Ages, Krampus was transformed into something different, a tamed demon subordinate to St. Nicholas, serving the purposes of Christian morality. He was no longer an independent force of nature, he was a servant of the saint, specifically punishing those who violated Christian teachings. His appearance was deliberately modeled after medieval descriptions of demons: horns, dark fur, animal characteristics, chains, symbolizing that he was chained to the service of good. This transformation served multiple purposes for the Church. First, it allowed people to maintain a familiar figure from their ancient traditions, reducing resistance to conversion. Second, it subordinated this figure to Christian authority, visually demonstrating Christianity's superiority over old beliefs. Third, it created a powerful pedagogical tool for teaching Christian morality, especially to children who might not understand abstract theological arguments, but certainly understood the threat of a terrifying creature. But here's what's fascinating. The Christianization of Krampus was never completely successful. People adopted the new narrative framework superficially, but maintained older elements that didn't fit perfectly into Christian theology. In many local traditions, Krampus retains an autonomy and power he theoretically shouldn't have if he were truly just St. Nicholas's servant. He frequently appears without the saint, operating according to his own agenda. His punishments sometimes seem arbitrary or excessive by Christian standards of proportional justice. This suggests that in the minds of common people, Krampus was never completely domesticated by the Church. He remained a liminal figure, partially Christian, partially pagan, partially something older and stranger that resisted easy categorization. Are you enjoying discovering the hidden layers behind these traditions? If you want to continue exploring how ancient beliefs were transformed and what this reveals about power, culture, and resistance, consider subscribing to the channel. This helps our community grow, and you'll receive notifications whenever we publish new stories exploring forgotten aspects of human history. And leave a comment saying where you're watching from and what time it is there. We've had viewers from every continent, and it's incredible to see how these stories connect people across time zones and borders. The transformation of Frau Perchta followed a similar path, but even more complex. Perchta was originally a figure associated with the Germanic goddess Holda or Hulda, a feminine deity connected with spinning, weaving, winter, and the underworld. Hulda was an ambiguous figure, neither good nor evil by Christian standards, but operating according to her own ancient laws. When Christianity arrived, the Church tried various strategies with Perchta. In some regions, they tried to transform her into Saint Bertha, a Christian saint associated with charity and work. But this transformation never completely took hold, because people maintained the darker stories, the visceral punishments, the specific demands about spinning and domestic work, the food taboos during the 12 nights that had no basis in official Christian doctrine. In other regions, the Church took the opposite approach, completely demonized Perchta, declaring her a witch or demon. But this also failed to eliminate the belief because people continued to see her as a force that rewarded as much as punished, that had her own legitimate rules that preceded and transcended Christianity. The result was an extraordinarily complex figure who existed in multiple versions simultaneously, depending on who was telling the story and for what purpose. For priests trying to reinforce Christian doctrine, Perchta was a demon who punished those who violated church teachings. For peasant women teaching their daughters to spin, Perchta was an older figure who rewarded hard work and domestic skill according to standards that had nothing to do with theology. For storytellers maintaining oral traditions, Perchta was a liminal figure who moved between worlds, connecting the present with a pre-Christian past that was never completely forgotten. This multiplicity of interpretations reveals something profound about how Christianization actually worked at the popular level. The Church could control official doctrine, could build churches and ordain priests, could even impose punishments for heresy. But it couldn't completely control the stories people told each other in their homes, in the fields, during winter work, when darkness came early and stories helped pass the long nights. In these unofficial stories, the ancient figures maintained power and relevance that official Christian doctrine could never completely eliminate. Because these figures spoke to lived realities about work, survival, the rhythms of the seasons, the demands of agricultural life, in ways that abstract theology simply couldn't. The Icelandic Yule Lads present an even more interesting case of resistance to Christianization. Iceland was officially Christianized in the year 1000, relatively late compared to most of Europe. But the conversion was largely political, a decision made by the National Assembly to avoid civil war and maintain trade ties with Christian Europe. At the popular level, the Old Norse beliefs continued for centuries, often coexisting comfortably with nominal Christianity. The Yule Lads were never Christianized in the same way as Krampus or Perchta. They remained figures of Icelandic folklore, connected to the harsh realities of life on a volcanic island in the North Atlantic, where winter was brutal and resources were scarce. The Icelandic Church disapproved of them, but never managed to eliminate them or transform them into proper Christian figures. Part of the reason for this was Iceland's isolation. Without the constant physical presence of powerful ecclesiastical authorities, without great cathedrals or wealthy monasteries, without the institutional infrastructure the Church had on the continent, Icelandic Christianity developed its own distinctive character. It was more tolerant of pagan survivals, more willing to allow old stories to coexist with new beliefs. This leads us to an important insight. Christianization wasn't a uniform process that happened the same way everywhere. It was highly variable depending on factors such as geography, the Church's institutional power, the strength of existing local traditions, and the practical needs of communities. In regions where the Church was powerful and well organized, like parts of Germany and Austria, the Christianization of folkloric figures was more complete, though never entirely successful. In more remote regions or where the Church had less institutional power, like Iceland, parts of rural Scandinavia, isolated mountainous areas of the Alps, the ancient figures retained much more of their pre-Christian character. But there's another dimension to this story that's often overlooked. Christianization wasn't just something the Church did to common people, it was also something common people did to Christianity. They didn't passively accept the new beliefs imposed from above. They negotiated, adapted, reinterpreted, and created hybrid versions that made sense within their own lives and needs. When Alpine peasants adopted St. Nicholas but insisted on keeping Krampus, they weren't simply being stubborn or superstitious. They were making a sophisticated cultural choice, accepting elements of Christianity that offered value, a protective saint, connection to broader European civilization, access to sacraments that could be socially necessary, while maintaining elements of older traditions that spoke to their lived realities in ways official Christianity couldn't. This cultural negotiation created what historians call popular Christianity, local versions of the faith that often differed significantly from official doctrine, but which were what most people actually believed and practiced. And the dark figures of winter were central components of this popular Christianity. The official church might disapprove of Krampus, but local priests often participated in Krampus festivals because they knew their congregations valued these traditions. Bishops could issue edicts against beliefs in Perchta, but these edicts were largely ignored in rural villages where Perchta stories served important social functions. Ecclesiastical authorities could denounce the Yule Lads as pagan superstition, but Icelandic families continued telling the stories because they were part of who they were. This tension between official Christianity and popular Christianity persisted for centuries, and in many places still exists today. And it reveals something fundamental about how religion actually functions in the lives of common people, not as an abstract and consistent theological system, but as a collection of practices, stories, and beliefs that are constantly negotiated, reinterpreted, and adapted to serve practical and emotional needs. So when we look at Krampus running through the streets of a modern alpine town, what exactly are we seeing? A pagan survival, a medieval Christian creation, a modern invention disguised as ancient tradition? The answer is all of these things simultaneously. Krampus is a layered figure carrying traces of multiple eras, multiple interpretations, multiple cultural needs. And perhaps this layered nature is precisely what allows these traditions to survive. They're not fragile historical artifacts that must be preserved in their pure, original form. They're living entities that evolve, accumulating new meanings while maintaining connections to older layers. Each generation adds its own layer of interpretation, and all the layers coexist, available to be accessed depending on context and need. This contrasts sharply with how Christmas evolved in the United States. The American Santa Claus was largely created in the 19th century by writers, artists, and eventually advertising professionals. He didn't emerge organically from centuries of cultural negotiation between different belief systems. He was deliberately designed to serve specific purposes, creating a unified national identity, promoting middle-class values, and eventually facilitating commercial consumption. The result is a remarkably one-dimensional figure. Santa Claus has no layers. He doesn't carry traces of multiple eras or belief systems. He is exactly what he appears to be, a cheerful and universally benevolent figure who exists to distribute gifts and promote holiday cheer. There's no ambiguity, no tension, no hidden depth. This makes him more accessible and commercially viable, but it also makes him, at some fundamental level, less interesting, less rich, less capable of speaking to multiple dimensions of human experience. The European figures that maintain their layers, their partially obscured but not eliminated pagan roots, their incomplete Christian transformations, their modern adaptations that don't completely erase earlier versions, offer something Santa Claus cannot: depth, complexity, the sense of being connected to something much older and stranger than yourself. And perhaps that's what people are seeking when, increasingly, they become interested in these European traditions. Not just exoticism or historical curiosity, but a hunger for narratives that acknowledge life is complex, that it contains both light and shadow, that it cannot be reduced to simple, commercially viable messages. As you contemplate these ideas, allowing them to settle into your consciousness as sleep approaches, consider: what do your own traditions carry in their layers? What older stories are hidden beneath the versions you know? And what might be discovered if you began to dig, to ask questions, to look for the tensions and contradictions that reveal where different eras and belief systems met and negotiated? Because the story of the Christianization of winter figures isn't just about the past. It's about how cultural change always works, through negotiation, resistance, adaptation, and the creation of hybrids that carry traces of multiple sources. And these processes are still happening today in our own lives and communities, if we're attentive enough to notice them. For centuries, the dark figures of European winter served a purpose that went far beyond entertainment or cultural preservation. They were sophisticated pedagogical tools, instruments of social control, and mechanisms for transmitting community norms from one generation to the next. To fully understand these traditions, we need to examine not just what they were, but what they did, the social functions they fulfilled in pre-modern communities. Have you ever stopped to think about how societies without formal educational systems, without mass media, without extensive governmental infrastructure, managed to maintain social order and transmit values? How did an isolated alpine village, where most people never traveled more than a few kilometers from where they were born, ensure that each new generation learned the behaviors necessary for communal survival? The answer lies partially in ritualized narratives, stories told repeatedly, performed publicly, incorporated into annual celebrations that the entire community witnessed. And the dark figures of winter were central components of this cultural transmission system. Consider the basic structure of the Krampus and St. Nicholas tradition. Once a year, usually on the night of December 5th, these figures visited homes. St. Nicholas asked parents about their children's behavior during the year. Children who had been obedient, hard-working, and respectful received gifts. Traditionally, fruits, nuts, small candies. Children who had been disobedient, lazy, or disrespectful faced Krampus, who carried birch rods and made theatrical threats. This structure created an annual accountability system. Children knew that once a year there would be a moment of public judgment where their entire year's behavior would be evaluated, not by their parents, who could be persuaded, manipulated, or ignored, but by external figures invested with supernatural or communal authority. The genius of this system lay in its externalization of authority. Parents didn't need to be the sole enforcers of discipline. They could invoke external forces. Krampus is watching. Krampus knows when you disobey. Krampus will come in December. This removed part of the tension from the parent-child relationship, placing the source of consequences outside the immediate family dynamic. But the system served even deeper purposes than simply helping individual parents control individual children. It reinforced specific community norms that were essential for survival in pre-industrial agricultural societies. What behaviors did Krampus and similar figures specifically punish? The stories are remarkably consistent across regions and centuries. Laziness, disobedience to parents, disrespect for elders, food waste, task negligence, lying, stealing. These aren't abstract moral values, they're specific behaviors that in an agricultural community where survival depended on cooperative work and carefully managed resources could literally mean the difference between life and death for the entire community. A lazy child who didn't complete their tasks wasn't just an inconvenience to their parents. They were a threat to the family's ability to produce enough food, which in turn affected the community's ability to survive winter. A child who wasted food wasn't just being rude, they were endangering scarce resources that might be needed when famine threatened. A child who disobeyed elders wasn't just being rebellious, they were rejecting the accumulated wisdom that had allowed the community to survive for generations. In this context, the punishments threatened by Krampus, though theatrical and exaggerated, made perfect sense. They were proportional not to the individual crime, but to the risk that behavior represented if it became widespread. A community where laziness was tolerated wouldn't survive. A community where waste was accepted would starve. A community where youth didn't respect the wisdom of elders would repeat fatal mistakes. The dark figures, then, weren't about cruelty or trauma. They were about communal survival disguised as folklore. Frau Perchta illustrates this even more clearly. Her demands were extraordinarily specific. Women must have spun their quota of flax during the year. No work could be done during the 12 nights between Christmas and Epiphany except essential animal care. Certain foods must be consumed during this period, others avoided. Why such specific rules? Because each one corresponded to practical survival needs. Spinning flax was essential for producing adequate winter clothing. Not doing your part put the entire family at risk. The prohibition on work during the 12 nights forced a period of rest after the exhausting harvest season, and before winter work began, it was essentially a public health mandate disguised as religious taboo. The food rules ensured that certain foods were preserved for specific periods of winter when they would be most needed. Perchta, then, wasn't an arbitrarily cruel figure. She was the personification of rules that a community had learned through centuries of trial and error were necessary to survive in a hostile environment. Her punishments were memorable and visceral precisely because the rules she enforced were literally matters of life or death. The Icelandic Yule Lads follow the same pattern. Each one represents a specific threat to the scarce resources of a winter Icelandic farm. The sausage swiper threatened preserved meat. The spoon licker and pot scraper represented food waste. The sheepcoat clod threatened essential livestock. The candle stealer threatened precious light during the dark months. Telling stories about these figures to children wasn't idle entertainment. It was practical education about all the ways a family could lose the resources necessary to survive winter. Each Yule lad was a memorable lesson about vigilance, about protecting what you had, about not wasting anything. But these figures didn't just teach children, they also served important functions for adults and for the community as a whole. Public festivals, like the Krampuslauf, were communal performances where social norms were reaffirmed and reinforced. When the entire village gathered to watch Krampus run through the streets, it wasn't just entertainment. It was a ritual of social renewal, a collective reminder of the shared values that held the community together. These festivals also served as social pressure valves. During most of the year, pre-modern societies were rigidly hierarchical and controlled. But during certain festivals, normal rules were temporarily suspended. People could wear masks and assume different identities. Youth could perform transgressive behaviors that would normally be punished. There was space for chaos, disorder, inversion of social norms. Anthropologists call these rituals of inversion limited periods when normal rules are suspended, allowing social tensions to be released in controlled ways. The Krampuslauf functioned partially this way. Young men could dress as demons, run through the streets, make noise, frighten people. Behaviors that would be completely unacceptable at any other time. But because it happened within a specific ritual context at a specific time of year, it was not only tolerated, but celebrated. This served an important psychological and social function. It allowed energies that could otherwise become destructive to be channeled into culturally sanctioned forms. It was a way of maintaining social order not through constant repression, but through periodic and controlled release. The dark figures also served functions for adult individuals dealing with the anxieties and fears of pre-modern life. When you live in a society where death is omnipresent, where children die regularly, where famine is a recurring threat, where diseases have no cure, where winter kills, you need ways to process this constant fear. Figures like Krampus and Perchta offered this. They personified diffuse fears into specific and nameable forms, and crucially, they offered ways to negotiate with these fears. If you behaved correctly, if you followed the rules, if you did your work, you would be protected. There was an illusion of control in a world that was largely uncontrollable. This is psychologically sophisticated. Diffuse and nameless fear is paralyzing, but fear personified in a specific figure with specific rules that can be followed to avoid it is manageable. The dark figures transformed existential anxiety into something that could be ritually confronted and symbolically defeated through correct behavior. But here's where the story becomes more complicated and more interesting. These same tools that served legitimate communal functions could also be, and were, used for less benign purposes. They could be instruments of oppressive social control, ways to reinforce unjust hierarchies, methods of suppressing dissent or difference. Consider how these traditions reinforced rigid gender roles. Perchta specifically punished women who hadn't spun enough. This wasn't just about linen production, it was about keeping women in specific domestic roles, punishing those who deviated from social expectations. A woman who neglected spinning might be doing so because she was ill, or because she had other urgent responsibilities, or because she simply wasn't good at spinning. But Perchta's narrative didn't allow for these nuances. It enforced a rigid rule that didn't recognize individual circumstances. Similarly, Krampus reinforced absolute obedience to parental and communal authority. But what if that authority was abusive? What if the elders were wrong? What if community rules were unjust? Krampus's narrative offered no space for questioning legitimate authority. It simply equated obedience with virtue and disobedience with deserved punishment. These figures could also be used to reinforce religious conformity. After Christianization, punishable behaviors often included failing to attend church, working on holy days, or questioning religious doctrine. What began as a tool for teaching behaviors essential for communal survival also became a tool for suppressing religious dissent. And in societies where these traditions coexisted with witch hunts and religious persecution, as in much of Europe from the 15th to 17th centuries, the lines between educational folklore and real violence could become dangerously blurred. Women accused of witchcraft were often described in terms that echoed figures like Perchta. The language of folklore and the language of persecution overlapped and mutually reinforced each other. So how do we evaluate these traditions? Were they essential tools of communal survival and cultural transmission, or were they instruments of oppressive social control? The uncomfortable answer is both, simultaneously. They served legitimate and necessary functions within their original contexts, but also reinforced power structures that were often unjust and that caused real suffering to real individuals. This ambiguity is crucial to understand. It's tempting to romanticize these traditions as pure ancient wisdom or condemn them as simply oppressive. But reality is more complex. They were products of societies that faced genuine survival challenges, but that were also deeply hierarchical, often unjust, and sometimes brutal. And this brings us back to the present and the question of what we do with these traditions today. When modern societies celebrate Krampus or tell stories of Perchta, what exactly are they celebrating? Communal wisdom about responsibility and consequence, or social control structures that were often oppressive? Perhaps the answer is that they're celebrating complexity itself. The recognition that human life has always involved negotiating tensions between individual and communal needs, between freedom and order, between change and tradition. The dark figures don't offer simple answers. They offer complex questions disguised as folklore. And perhaps that's what makes them valuable today, in an era that often prefers simple narratives and easy solutions. They remind us that our ancestors dealt with dilemmas that had no perfect solutions, that they made choices involving real trade-offs, that they created systems that were simultaneously functional and problematic. As you reflect on these ideas, allowing them to circulate in your mind as sleep approaches, consider what systems in your own life and society serve legitimate functions but also have costs we prefer not to examine. What traditions do you maintain that carry within them both wisdom and problems? And how do you navigate the complexity of inheriting systems that are simultaneously valuable and problematic? Because the story of the dark figures of winter isn't just about the past. It's about the permanent nature of human dilemmas that have no perfect answers, only choices with consequences we must be willing to examine honestly. When millions of Europeans crossed the Atlantic between the 17th and 20th centuries, they brought with them more than just material belongings. They carried memories, stories, traditions, and beliefs, invisible cultural baggage that was often more precious and more enduring than any physical object. And among these traditions were the dark figures of winter, which would make an extraordinary journey across the ocean and through time, transforming in ways their original creators could never have imagined. The story of how these European traditions transformed upon encountering American soil is fascinating because it reveals so much about the nature of cultural identity, assimilation, and what happens when traditions are removed from their original contexts and planted in completely different soil. Have you ever thought about what happens to a tradition when the conditions that created it no longer exist? When a practice developed to teach winter survival in isolated alpine villages is transplanted to American cities with central heating and supermarkets. When rituals created for homogeneous and stable communities encounter a society of diverse immigrants and constant mobility, does the tradition die, adapt, or transform into something completely new? The German immigrants who arrived in Pennsylvania in the 18th and 19th centuries brought Belsnickel with them. But the America they found was radically different from the Europe they had left. There were no ancient villages with centuries of shared history. There was not the same rigid community structure where everyone knew everyone and social norms were enforced through constant collective pressure. There was not the same kind of life-threatening winter that made communal cooperation absolutely essential. Instead, there was frontier, mobility, individualism, ethnic diversity, and a dominant ideology of self-invention and personal freedom that was fundamentally different from the communal values that had given rise to figures like Belsnickel. So what happened to Belsnickel in America? He survived but transformed. In German-American communities that managed to maintain some degree of cultural cohesion, particularly in rural areas of Pennsylvania, where entire communities of immigrants settled together, Belsnickel continued to be celebrated. But even in these communities, he began to change. The figure became less threatening, more theatrical. Belsnickel visits became more about entertainment and cultural preservation than about genuine enforcement of community norms. Children were still tested about their behavior, but everyone understood it was a performance, a game, a way to maintain connection with ancestral heritage rather than a serious mechanism of social control. This transformation reveals something important. Traditions are not static objects that can simply be transported from one place to another. They are living practices that exist in relation to specific contexts. When context changes radically, the tradition must transform or die. Belsnickel survived by transforming from functional pedagogical tool into ethnic identity marker. He no longer served to teach behaviors essential for communal survival, because those behaviors were no longer essential in the same way in America. Instead, he served to mark boundaries. We are German Americans. We maintain the traditions of our ancestors. We are different from the Anglo-Americans around us. This identity marking function became even more important as immigrant communities faced pressure to assimilate. During World War I, when anti-German sentiment swept the United States, many German-American communities abandoned visible traditions, stopped speaking German in public, changed business names, tried to appear as American as possible. But in private spaces, within closed communities, traditions like Belsnickel were maintained precisely because they represented connection to a heritage that was under threat. This illustrates a pattern that repeats across immigrant communities. The greater the pressure to assimilate, the more precious distinctive traditions become, but also the more they transform from functional practices into symbols of identity. But not all European traditions made this journey successfully. Krampus, for example, largely failed to establish itself in America during the great waves of immigration. Why? Part of the reason was that he was simply too strange, too threatening, too incompatible with emerging American values about childhood and celebration. The 19th century saw a radical transformation in American attitudes toward children. Influenced by reform movements, new theories about child development, and middle-class ideals about domesticity, American childhood increasingly came to be seen as a period of innocence that should be protected, not as a period of rigorous training for adult life. In this context, a demonic figure who threatened children with physical punishment didn't fit. It violated emerging sensibilities about how children should be treated. Even if Austrian or Bavarian immigrants wanted to maintain the Krampus tradition, they faced social disapproval from neighbors who viewed the practice as cruel or inappropriate. Moreover, America was actively building a unified national identity that transcended specific ethnic origins. Part of this project involved creating shared American traditions that everyone could participate in, regardless of background. The American Christmas that emerged in the 19th and early 20th centuries was deliberately designed to be universal, accessible, and non-threatening. Santa Claus, derived from St. Nicholas but fundamentally reimagined, became the central figure of this American Christmas. And crucially, he had no dark counterpoint. The naughty and nice list was mentioned, but without real consequences. All children received gifts. American Christmas was about universal abundance, not about judgment and consequence. This transformation wasn't accidental. It was the result of specific cultural and commercial forces. Writers like Washington Irving and Clement Clarke Moore created literary versions of St. Nicholas that emphasized his kindness and removed any threatening elements. Cartoonist Thomas Nast created the iconic visual image of Santa Claus we still recognize today: rotund, jolly, dressed in red, completely non-threatening. And then came commercial interests. Department stores discovered that a cheerful Santa Claus who promised gifts for all children was excellent for business. The advertising industry amplified this image. By the early 20th century, Santa Claus had become a central figure of American consumer culture, and any element of judgment or consequence had been completely removed. This commercialized Santa Claus was then exported back to Europe and to the rest of the world, often competing with or replacing older local traditions. It's one of the ironies of cultural history. A figure derived from European traditions was transformed in America and then re-imported to Europe in a form that was fundamentally different and often incompatible with the original traditions. But the story doesn't end there. In the last 2 decades, something surprising has happened. Krampus has begun appearing in America, not through immigrant communities maintaining ancestral traditions, but through renewed interest in obscure folklore, a hunger for alternatives to commercialized Christmas, and the spread of information through the internet. Krampus festivals began appearing in American cities. Films and documentaries about Krampus were produced. Young Americans with no ancestral connection to the Alps began taking interest in this figure their immigrant great-grandparents had deliberately left behind. What's happening here? Why is a tradition that failed to establish itself during the great waves of immigration suddenly finding an audience in 21st century America? Part of the answer lies in a reaction against what American Christmas has become. For many people, modern Christmas feels empty, an orgy of consumption without real meaning, a celebration so sanitized and commercialized that it has lost any ability to touch something deeper. Krampus offers an alternative, something strange, something with sharp edges, something that acknowledges life, contains both darkness and light. But it's important to recognize that the Krampus emerging in contemporary America is not the same Krampus of alpine villages. He has been removed from his original functional context and transformed into something different. Part counterculture symbol, part ironic commentary on Christmas consumerism, part Gothic aesthetic, part nostalgia for imagined authenticity. Modern Americans participating in Krampus festivals aren't really trying to recreate alpine traditions. They're using elements of these traditions to create something new that speaks to their own needs and contexts. They're performing a critique of commercial Christmas, expressing an aesthetic that values the strange and transgressive, creating community around shared interests in obscure folklore. Is this cultural appropriation? Cultural evolution? Both? Neither? These categories may not be adequate to capture what's really happening. What we're seeing is how culture has always worked. Elements are borrowed, transformed, recombined, invested, with new meanings, used for new purposes. Alpine people who have maintained Krampus traditions for centuries have mixed feelings about this American interest. Some are pleased that their traditions are receiving international attention. Others feel that something essential is being lost or distorted when Krampus is removed from his communal context and transformed into entertainment for strangers. Both reactions are valid, and the tension between them reveals something fundamental about tradition and cultural change. There are no legitimate owners of traditions who can dictate how they should be used. Once a cultural practice enters the world, it's available to be adopted, adapted, and transformed by anyone who finds meaning in it. But it's also true that something can be lost in these transformations: context, nuance, the layers of meaning that only make sense within specific communities with specific histories. So are we witnessing the preservation of European traditions in America, or the creation of something completely new that merely uses European elements as raw material? Again, the answer is probably both. And perhaps the distinction isn't as important as recognizing that this is an ongoing process. Traditions have always been in flux, have always been contested, have always been transformed by each new generation, and each new context. What's different now is the speed and scale of transformation. The internet allows information about obscure traditions to spread instantly around the world. People can learn about Krampus, watch videos of Krampuslauf, order masks from Alpine craftsmen, and organize their own events, all without ever visiting the Alps or having any personal connection to the communities where these traditions originated. This democratizes access to culture, but also potentially decontextualizes and superficializes it. You can learn facts about Krampus online, but you may miss the deeper layers of meaning that are only accessible through long-term participation in communities where the tradition is rooted. As you contemplate these ideas, letting them settle as sleep approaches, consider: what traditions do you maintain and how have they been transformed across generations or through migration? What was lost in these transformations and what was gained? And how do you decide which traditions are worth keeping, which are worth transforming, and which are worth letting go? Because the story of the migration of dark figures across the Atlantic isn't just about specific folklore. It's about the nature of cultural identity in a world of constant movement, about how we create continuity amid change, and about the choices we make about what to carry with us and what to leave behind when we cross borders, whether geographic, temporal, or cultural. In the 21st century, the dark figures of European winter have become unexpected battlegrounds in broader cultural wars about identity, memory, social justice, and the meaning of tradition in democratic and pluralistic societies. What began as local practices in relatively homogeneous communities is now debated in national parliaments, protested in the streets, discussed in newspaper editorials, and dissected on digital platforms by people from around the world. These controversies reveal fundamental tensions in modern societies, tensions that go far beyond any specific tradition and touch on questions about who has the right to define national culture, how societies should deal with problematic legacies, and whether it's possible to honor the past while living according to contemporary values that may contradict aspects of that past. Have you ever wondered why certain traditions suddenly become controversial after centuries of relatively peaceful acceptance? Why do practices that were simply part of the cultural fabric suddenly become objects of intense scrutiny and debate? And what do these controversies reveal about deeper changes in the societies experiencing them? The most intense and prolonged debate has been about Sinterklaas's helpers in the Netherlands. For decades, the traditional representation of these figures remained largely unquestioned within Dutch society. Families celebrated the annual arrival of Sinterklaas and his helpers as an innocent and joyful children's tradition. But starting in the 2010s, this narrative of innocence was increasingly challenged. Anti-racism activists, many of them Dutch people of Caribbean or Surinamese descent, regions that were colonized by the Netherlands, began publicly protesting the tradition. They argued that the representation of the helpers perpetuated harmful racial stereotypes, caused real pain to people from minority communities, and was incompatible with the Netherlands' stated values of equality and respect for human dignity. The initial protests were small but received significant media attention. The response was immediate and often hostile. Many Dutch people felt that a cherished childhood tradition was being unfairly attacked. They argued that the tradition had no racist intent, that it was simply part of Dutch culture, and that critics were importing American sensibilities about racial issues that weren't relevant to the Dutch context. This initial response, defensive and often dismissive of the concerns raised, is a pattern that repeats in many controversies about cultural traditions. When practices that are central to someone's identity are challenged, the emotional response often precedes rational reflection. People feel that not just a tradition is being attacked, but their own identity, their childhood memories, their connection to parents and grandparents who also celebrated this tradition. But as the debate continued, through years, not months, something more complex began to emerge. Public opinion polls showed gradual shifts in attitudes, particularly among younger generations. More Dutch people began to recognize that regardless of intent, the tradition caused real pain to fellow citizens, and that this mattered. Some cities began experimenting with modified versions of the tradition. The helpers were redesigned with only partially darkened faces, explained as chimney soot, rather than representations of specific people. Other cities adopted helpers of multiple colors, rainbow piets that clearly didn't represent any real racial group. Some maintained the traditional version, arguing that local communities should have autonomy to decide their own cultural practices. This variety of responses illustrates both the strength and weakness of decentralized democracies. There's no central authority that can simply decree how a tradition should be practiced throughout the country. Instead, there's constant negotiation at multiple levels: national, municipal, communal, familial. This makes change slow and uneven, but also allows for local experimentation and adaptation. The Dutch debate also revealed deeper divisions in society. It wasn't just about a specific tradition, but about broader questions of national identity, immigration, multiculturalism, and social change. For some Dutch people, defending the tradition became a way to express resistance to what they saw as overly rapid changes in their country's ethnic and cultural composition. For others, modifying the tradition became a symbol of commitment to a more inclusive society. These dynamics aren't unique to the Netherlands. They reflect tensions that exist in many Western societies dealing with colonial legacies, increasing diversity, and questions about how to create national identities that can accommodate difference. But the dark figures of winter have generated other types of controversies as well. In Austria and Germany, the Krampus has occasionally sparked debates about violence, public safety, and appropriate behavior during festivals. At some Krampus events, particularly those that attract large crowds and tourists, there have been incidents where performers became excessively aggressive. People have been pushed, struck with rods harder than appropriate, or frightened in ways that crossed the line from theatrical to genuinely threatening. There have been reports of intoxicated performers using the anonymity of masks to behave in ways they normally wouldn't. These incidents have raised questions about how to maintain traditions that involve elements of controlled chaos and ritual transgression. How do you preserve the transgressive aspect that's an essential part of the tradition while ensuring public safety and preventing abuse? Where's the line between appropriate theatrical performance and unacceptable behavior? Some communities have responded with stricter regulations. Registration requirements for performers, alcohol prohibitions, designated areas where Krampus can and cannot go, increased police presence. Others have resisted these regulations, arguing that over-domesticating Krampus removes precisely what makes the tradition powerful and meaningful. This tension between preserving authenticity and ensuring safety is another recurring dilemma with traditions involving elements of danger or transgression. How much can you regulate and sanitize a tradition before it loses its essential character? But how much risk and transgressive behavior can you tolerate before the tradition becomes genuinely problematic? There are no easy answers. Different communities have arrived at different balances, and these balances continue to be negotiated and adjusted each year. Controversies about these traditions also reveal broader shifts in how we think about childhood and appropriate experiences for children. In the 21st century, particularly in affluent Western societies, there's a growing tendency to protect children from anything that might be scary, disturbing, or uncomfortable. This has led some critics to question whether traditions like Krampus are appropriate for modern children. They argue that exposing children to genuinely terrifying figures can cause unnecessary trauma, that there are better ways to teach responsibility and consequence that don't involve fear. Defenders of the traditions respond that children are more resilient than we often assume, that experiences of controlled and ritualized fear can actually be beneficial for development, and that protecting children from all discomfort leaves them poorly prepared for a world that will inevitably contain challenges and difficulties. Research in developmental psychology offers evidence for both sides. Some research suggests that exposure to controlled and predictable fears can help children develop resilience and coping skills. Other research indicates that intensely frightening experiences can have lasting negative effects, particularly for children who are already anxious or who don't have adequate support to process the experience. As with many questions about child development, the answer probably depends on individual factors: the child's temperament, family context, how the experience is framed and processed. What works well for one child in a family, where the tradition is understood and contextualized, may be genuinely disturbing for another child in different circumstances. But this nuance is often lost in public debates, which tend to polarize between traditions are always good and should be preserved versus traditions that scare children are always bad and should be abandoned. Controversies about dark winter figures also connect to broader debates about cultural heritage and who has the right to define and modify traditions. When UNESCO designates practices like the Krampus as intangible cultural heritage, does it protect them or freeze them? Does it make it harder for local communities to modify them in response to changing needs and values? There's an inherent tension between cultural preservation and cultural evolution. Traditions that cannot change eventually become irrelevant and die. But traditions that change too rapidly or radically may lose the characteristics that made them valuable in the first place. Finding the right balance is a constant challenge, and different stakeholders often have very different opinions about where that balance should be. Academics and folklorists may prioritize preserving authentic forms of traditions. Local communities may prioritize keeping traditions relevant and meaningful to their contemporary lives. Activists may prioritize ensuring traditions don't perpetuate harm. Tourism industries may prioritize aspects of traditions that are marketable and attractive to visitors. Each perspective has legitimacy, but they often conflict. These controversies also highlight how traditions can mean fundamentally different things to different groups within the same society. For some Dutch people, the Sinterklaas tradition represents family connection, childhood memories, cultural continuity. For Dutch people of Caribbean descent, the same tradition may represent painful reminders of colonialism, exclusion from the dominant national narrative, and the experience of having their humanity questioned through caricatures. Both experiences are real and valid, and that's precisely why these controversies are so difficult to resolve. It's not a case of one side being completely right and the other completely wrong. It's a case of different groups having genuinely different experiences of the same cultural practice, and these experiences being incompatible in ways that can't be easily reconciled. In pluralistic societies, these tensions are inevitable. The question isn't how to eliminate them, that's impossible, but how to navigate them in ways that respect everyone's dignity, that allow genuine dialogue instead of just confrontation, and that recognize cultural change is an ongoing process, not a problem that can be solved once and for all. Are you following how ancient traditions have become modern battlegrounds? If these explorations of culture, identity, and social change are resonating with you, consider subscribing to the channel. You'll receive notifications of new stories that dive into the complexities of human experience across time and space. And leave a comment saying where you're watching from and what time it is there. Our community extends across dozens of countries and time zones, and each comment reminds us how stories connect people across differences that would otherwise separate us. As you reflect on these controversies, allowing them to circulate in your mind as sleep approaches, consider: how do you balance respect for tradition with commitment to values that may conflict with aspects of those traditions? How do you respond when practices that are meaningful to you are criticized by others who experience them differently? And how can societies create space for genuine dialogue about these difficult questions without polarizing into irreconcilable camps? Because the controversies about the dark figures of winter aren't just about specific folklore. They're about deeper questions of how we live together in societies characterized by difference, how we honor the past while building more just futures, and how we navigate the permanent tension between continuity and change that defines the human condition. Behind the elaborate masks, centuries-old rituals, and contemporary controversies, there's a fundamental psychological question that the dark figures of winter have always addressed. What is the role of fear in healthy human development? And how should societies balance protection with preparation, comfort with challenge, safety with resilience? These aren't abstract questions. They touch the heart of how we raise the next generation, how we transmit not just information but wisdom, and how we prepare young people for a world that will inevitably contain both joy and difficulty, both success and failure, both light and shadow. Have you ever considered why almost all human cultures developed scary stories to tell children? Why are fairy tales filled with witches, wolves, giants, and monsters? Why do parents in societies as diverse as medieval alpine villages and contemporary Amazonian tribes tell stories that deliberately frighten their children? The answer can't simply be cruelty or ignorance about child development. These practices are too universal, too persistent through time, to be merely mistakes that all cultures made independently. There must be something deeper happening, some function that ritualized and controlled fear serves in human development. Modern research in developmental psychology has begun exploring these questions, and the results are fascinating and complex. They suggest that our contemporary intuitions about protecting children from all fear may be missing something important that older cultures understood implicitly. Studies on what psychologists call tolerable stress versus toxic stress offer a useful framework. Toxic stress, chronic, unpredictable, without adequate support, is genuinely harmful to brain and emotional development. But tolerable stress, time-limited challenges, predictable in structure with adult support available, can actually promote resilience and development of coping skills. The dark figures of winter, in their original contexts, operated precisely within these parameters of tolerable stress. The fear they generated was time-limited. It happened at specific times of year, not constantly. It was predictable in structure. Children knew when to expect these figures and what they represented. And crucially, it happened within family and community contexts where adults were present to help children process the experience. A child who encountered Krampus during a community festival wasn't alone with their fear. They were surrounded by parents, older siblings, neighbors, all of whom had gone through the same experience and survived. The implicit message was, yes, this is scary, but you can handle it. We all handled it. And there are ways to protect yourself. Through correct behavior, through community connections, through courage. This framework of ritualized fear may have served important developmental functions. It offered children opportunities to practice courage in relatively safe circumstances. It taught that the world contains scary things, but that these things can be confronted and navigated. It created shared memories that linked generations. Grandparents could tell grandchildren about their own encounters with Krampus, creating narrative continuity through time. Research on rough-and-tumble play and scary games in children supports this perspective. Children in all cultures spontaneously engage in play that involves elements of fear. Chase games, hide and seek, ghost stories. They seem to have an innate need to explore fear in controlled contexts. Evolutionary psychologists suggest this may be a form of preparation, a way to develop emotional and behavioral responses that will be needed when real threats are encountered. In this perspective, figures like Krampus weren't arbitrary impositions by adults on reluctant children, but cultural elaborations of something children already naturally seek. opportunities to encounter and master fears in safe environments. But there's a crucial difference between fear that promotes resilience and fear that causes trauma. The line between the two isn't always clear and depends heavily on individual and contextual factors. A child with an anxious temperament, or a child who has already experienced real trauma, or a child without adequate family support, may be genuinely harmed by experiences that other children navigate easily. This suggests there's no universal answer about whether traditions like Krampus are good or bad for children. The answer depends on how they're implemented, the context in which they happen, and the needs and vulnerabilities of specific children. Traditional communities that maintained these practices for generations likely developed implicit wisdom about how to calibrate them appropriately. Parents knew their own children and could adjust exposure accordingly, perhaps keeping a particularly sensitive child farther from Krampus, or providing extra reassurance, or preparing the child in advance about what to expect. But when these traditions are removed from their original community contexts, when they become large-scale tourist events, or when they're re-implemented in societies without the accumulated cultural wisdom about how to make them work, these calibration mechanisms can be lost. The result can be experiences that are genuinely too intense or poorly framed for some children. This doesn't mean the traditions should be abandoned, but it suggests they need to be implemented with attention and sensitivity, not just repeated mechanically, because that's how it's always been done. The psychology of dark figures also connects to broader questions about how we teach morality and responsibility. Research on moral development in children shows that fear-based motivations, do this or something bad will happen to you, are less effective long-term than motivations based on understanding consequences and empathy. Children who behave well only because they fear punishment don't develop internal moral compasses. When the threat of punishment is removed, behavior often deteriorates. In contrast, children who understand why certain behaviors are important, who develop empathy for others, and who internalize values, maintain positive behavior even in the absence of external monitoring. This suggests that if dark figures were used primarily as threats, Krampus will get you if you don't behave, they may have been less pedagogically effective than their proponents believed. But if they were used as part of richer narrative frameworks that help children understand why certain behaviors mattered for communal well-being, they may have served more sophisticated functions. Historical evidence suggests reality was probably somewhere in the middle. Some families and communities use these figures in pedagogically sophisticated ways, integrating them into broader conversations about responsibility and community. Others used them primarily as simple threats to induce compliance. As with most cultural practices, there was significant variation in implementation and effectiveness. There's also an important developmental dimension that's often overlooked. The role of these traditions not just for children, but for adolescents and young adults. In many communities, participating in the Krampuslauf as a performer was a rite of passage for young men. They moved from being targets of Krampus to becoming Krampus, a transition that marked movement from childhood to adulthood. This aspect of the tradition served important psychological and social functions. It offered young people a culturally sanctioned role where they could express energy, aggression, and transgression in controlled ways. It created a shared experience that bonded peer groups and generations. It provided a sense of identity and belonging through participation in something larger than the individual. Modern societies often struggle to provide meaningful rites of passage that mark the transition to adulthood. The absence of such rituals can leave young people adrift without clear markers of maturity or culturally recognized ways to demonstrate they've achieved new status. In this context, traditions like the Krampuslauf may serve needs that go far beyond their original functions related to agricultural survival. The psychology of dark figures also connects to questions about how we process and integrate the shadow aspects of human existence. Psychologist Carl Jung wrote extensively about the concept of the shadow, the aspects of ourselves we deny or repress, but which don't disappear, only become unconscious and potentially more destructive. Jung argued that psychological health requires integrating the shadow, not denying it. We need to recognize and accept that we're capable of both kindness and cruelty, both generosity and selfishness, both courage and cowardice. Denying these shadow aspects doesn't eliminate them. It only makes them harder to manage consciously. In this perspective, figures like Krampus serve an important psychological function. They personify shadow aspects of human existence, making them visible and nameable, instead of pretending only goodness exists, as the exclusively positive Santa Claus does. They acknowledge that life contains both light and darkness, and that both must be recognized and integrated. Societies that maintain these dual figures may be, without necessarily articulating it in modern psychological terms, practicing a form of collective shadow integration. They're saying, yes, there are scary and dark aspects of existence. We won't pretend they don't exist. We'll acknowledge them, ritualize them, and thus keep them within manageable bounds. In contrast, cultures that completely eliminate dark elements from their celebrations and narratives may be setting themselves up for problems. The denied shadow doesn't disappear, it emerges in other ways, often more destructive because it's not acknowledged or ritualized. This may help explain some of the contemporary appeal of Krampus and similar figures. In a culture that often seems obsessed with positivity, where we're constantly exhorted to think positive, where social media presents carefully curated versions of perfectly happy lives, where admitting difficulty or darkness is often seen as weakness. There's a hunger for narratives that acknowledge the totality of human experience. Krampus offers this. He says, "Not everything is light. Not everyone deserves reward. There are consequences. There is darkness, and that's part of reality, not something to be denied or hidden." For some people, particularly those who feel alienated by the toxic positivity of contemporary culture, this message is deeply resonant. It offers permission to acknowledge aspects of experience that must otherwise be hidden or denied. As you contemplate these ideas, allowing them to move through your consciousness as sleep approaches, consider, how do you balance protection with preparation in your own life? What fears do you deliberately face, and which do you avoid? And what do your own traditions, and whether familial, cultural, or personal, teach about the balance between light and shadow, comfort and challenge, safety and growth? Because the psychology behind the dark figures of winter isn't just about historical practices or child development. It's about permanent questions of how we live fully in a world that contains both beauty and terror, both joy and suffering, and how we create meaning not despite this duality, but through its acceptance and integration. In recent decades, the dark figures of European winter have undergone a transformation their original creators could never have imagined. They've become commodities. What began as intimate community practices transmitted through generations in isolated villages is now packaged, marketed, and sold to tourists from around the world. Krampus masks are sold online. Krampus festivals attract thousands of paying visitors. Documentaries and films transform local traditions into global entertainment. This commercialization raises profound and often uncomfortable questions about authenticity, cultural ownership, and what happens when practices that were functionally integrated into community life are transformed into spectacles for external consumption. Have you ever thought about what happens to a tradition when it becomes a tourist attraction? When people who have no historical or cultural connection to a practice begin paying to watch or participate in it? Is the tradition preserved through this external interest, or is something essential lost when intimate practices are transformed into public performances for strangers? These questions have no simple answers. The commercialization of cultural traditions is simultaneously a threat to authenticity and often the only reason traditions survive economically in a modern world. Consider a small alpine village that has maintained Krampus traditions for centuries. Historically, the Krampuslauf was a community event. Local residents performed for other local residents, reaffirming shared bonds and common values. There was no external audience. There was no expectation of entertainment. It was simply something the community did for itself. But in recent decades, as interest in Krampus grew internationally, these villages discovered they could attract tourists willing to pay to witness these traditions. For rural communities often struggling economically, where young people leave for larger cities, where traditional industries have declined, where economic viability is uncertain, cultural tourism offers a potential lifeline. So villages began promoting their Krampus festivals. They created websites, posted videos, coordinated with tour operators. They expanded events that previously lasted a few hours into entire weekend festivals. They added infrastructure to accommodate visitors, parking, restrooms, food stalls, designated viewing areas. These changes brought real economic benefits. Local hotels filled up. Restaurants prospered. Craftsmen who make traditional Krampus masks found new markets. Young people who would otherwise have left the village found economic reasons to stay. But these changes also fundamentally transformed the nature of the traditions. When you're performing for tourists who paid to watch, you're no longer simply participating in a community ritual, you're providing entertainment. And that changes everything. How you perform, what you emphasize, how you structure the event. Performers begin exaggerating elements that tourists find most impressive or photographable. Masks become more elaborate and visually striking, but perhaps less connected to traditional local styles. Events are timed for tourist convenience rather than ritual significance. Elements that were subtle or meaningful only to insiders are amplified or explained for external audiences. The result is something that appears authentic to tourists who don't know better, but which long-time residents recognize as fundamentally different from what it used to be. It's not necessarily fake. The performers are still locals, the masks are still handmade, the basic rituals are still followed, but something intangible has changed. The tradition has become self-conscious, performative, in ways it wasn't when it was simply something the community did for itself. Anthropologists call this staged authenticity. Performances that are technically accurate, but have lost the quality of being lived practices and become representations of those practices. It's the difference between watching a family eat dinner in their own home and watching actors portraying a family eating dinner on a stage. The surface elements may be identical, but the quality of the experience is fundamentally different. But here's where the situation becomes even more complex. For many young participants in these communities, the tourist version is the only version they've ever known. They grew up with the Krampuslauf already being a tourist event. For them, this is the tradition. They don't experience it as less authentic because they have no memory of a pre-tourist version to compare it to. This raises a fascinating philosophical question. If no one alive remembers the original version of a tradition, is the current version less authentic? Or is authenticity always relative to the experience of those participating? Perhaps traditions are always authentic to those living them, regardless of how they've changed over time. The commercialization of Krampus has also happened in ways beyond tourism. Krampus masks, which traditionally were handmade by local craftsmen using techniques passed down through generations, are now mass-produced and sold online. You can order a Krampus mask from manufacturers in Asia who have never heard of alpine traditions and are simply responding to market demand. These mass-produced masks are often cheaper and more accessible than traditional handcrafted versions. They allow people around the world to participate in Krampus festivals or create their own themed events. They democratize access to a tradition that was previously geographically limited. but they also disconnect the tradition from its artisanal roots. Traditional Krampus masks were individual works of art, each unique, created by craftsmen who understood the cultural context and symbolic significance of what they were doing. Mass-produced masks are uniform products created for profit by people who may have no understanding of or interest in the tradition they're commodifying. Does this matter? It depends on what you value. If you value accessibility and broad participation, mass production is positive. If you value craftsmanship and connection to cultural context, it's a loss. Both perspectives probably have merit, and the tension between them can't be completely resolved. The commercialization of Krampus has also happened through media. Horror films featuring Krampus have been produced in various countries. Documentaries have explored the traditions. Television programs have featured segments about Krampus festivals. Each of these media representations reached audiences who would never experience the tradition directly, shaping how millions of people understand Krampus. But media representations necessarily simplify and distort. A horror film transforms Krampus into a generic monster, removing the specific cultural context that makes the figure meaningful. A documentary must condense centuries of complex history into an hour-long narrative that international audiences can follow. A news segment about a Krampus festival focuses on visually dramatic elements while missing nuances that only make sense to insiders. The result is that global understanding of Krampus is increasingly shaped not by people who grew up with the tradition, but by media professionals who are packaging it for mass consumption. This isn't necessarily malicious, it's often well-intentioned, but it inevitably transforms the tradition in the process of representing it. There's also a class dimension to the commercialization of these traditions. Tourists who travel to the Alps to experience authentic Krampus festivals tend to be relatively affluent, people with disposable income for international travel, hotel accommodation, and cultural experiences. The local communities performing these traditions are often economically marginalized, dependent on tourist revenue for survival. This creates a dynamic where wealthier people from elsewhere consume the culture of poorer communities, and these communities must modify their practices to meet tourists' expectations and preferences. There are uncomfortable parallels with other forms of cultural tourism where the power dynamic between observers and observed is unequal. Some cultural theorists argue this is a form of cultural colonialism. More powerful communities extracting cultural value from less powerful communities, transforming lived practices into commodities for external consumption. Others argue this is too harsh, that local communities have agency in this process and often benefit economically in ways they wouldn't otherwise. Again, both perspectives probably capture aspects of reality. The situation is complex, with both exploitation and mutual benefit, both loss and gain. Commercialization has also affected how local communities themselves relate to their traditions. When a practice becomes economically valuable, it can become an object of dispute and competition. Different villages compete to attract tourists, each claiming to have the most authentic or impressive version of the tradition. This can create tensions between communities that previously shared common cultural practices. It can also create pressure to innovate and differentiate. If the neighboring village is attracting more tourists with more elaborate masks or more dramatic performances, there's incentive to raise the stakes. This can lead to a kind of spectacle inflation where events become increasingly elaborate and commercialized, moving further and further from their original, more modest forms. But it would be too simplistic to see commercialization only as corruption of pure traditions. The reality is that traditions have always changed in response to economic conditions. The traditional forms we romanticize as authentic were themselves adaptations to specific economic and social circumstances. When those circumstances change, traditions must adapt or die. Alpine villages can no longer sustain themselves through subsistence agriculture the way they did centuries ago. The global economy has changed. If cultural tourism offers a way to maintain economic viability while preserving at least some elements of traditional practices, this may be preferable to the alternative, complete abandonment of traditions as communities disperse in search of economic opportunities elsewhere. Seen from this perspective, commercialization isn't simply a threat to authenticity, but potentially a survival mechanism that allows traditions to persist in modified forms rather than disappearing completely. The question, then, isn't whether commercialization is good or bad in absolute terms, but how it can be navigated in ways that maximize benefits while minimizing losses. How can communities generate necessary revenue from cultural tourism while maintaining some degree of control over how their traditions are represented and practiced? How can cultural meaning be preserved even when practices are partially transformed into commodities? There are no easy answers, but some communities are experimenting with approaches that attempt to balance these tensions. Some maintain separate events, public versions for tourists, and private versions only for community members. Some establish standards and certifications for traditional craftsmen, distinguishing authentic work from mass-produced imitations. Some use tourist revenue to fund cultural education for youth, ensuring traditional knowledge is transmitted even when practices are partially commercialized. These strategies don't resolve all tensions, but they represent attempts to consciously navigate complexity rather than simply passively accepting commercialization or rigidly resisting all change. As you contemplate these questions, allowing them to settle into your consciousness as sleep approaches, consider: what aspects of your own life or culture have been commercialized or transformed into commodities? How do you feel about these transformations? And how do you balance the need for economic viability with the desire to maintain practices and values that can't easily be reduced to market transactions? Because the story of the commercialization of the dark figures of winter isn't just about specific traditions, it's about broader tensions between culture and commerce, authenticity and adaptation, preservation and transformation that characterize life in a globalized world where almost everything can become a commodity, but where some values and practices resist reduction to market value. Behind the masks and rituals hidden in the folds of traditions that seem simply about celebration and folklore exist power structures that profoundly shaped who could participate, how, and with what meaning. The dark figures of European winter didn't exist in a social vacuum. They were part of complex systems that defined and reinforced gender roles, age hierarchies, and community power relations. To fully understand these traditions, we need to examine not just what they were superficially, but how they function to maintain or challenge social structures. And when we do this, we discover layers of meaning that are often omitted in contemporary celebrations or tourist representations of these practices. Have you ever stopped to think about who traditionally performed as Krampus? Who was allowed to wear the masks, carry the chains, run through the streets in ritually transgressive behavior? And who was excluded from these performances, relegated to the role of spectator or target? The answer reveals much about how these traditions functioned as rituals of gender and power. In practically all traditional communities that maintained Krampus practices, performers were exclusively young men, typically teenagers and men in their early 20s. Women were systematically excluded from performing as Krampus, relegated to audience roles or, in some cases, preferred targets of Krampus's attention. This gender division wasn't accidental or incidental. It was central to how the tradition functioned as a masculine rite of passage and as a mechanism for reinforcing gender norms. Performing as Krampus was a way for young men to demonstrate masculinity, test limits, and gain status within masculine hierarchies. The Krampuslauf offered young men a culturally sanctioned space to express aggression, physicality, and dominance, qualities associated with ideal masculinity in these societies. They could run, shout, make noise, frighten people, occupy public space in ways that would normally be restricted, and, crucially, they could do all this while masked, protected by anonymity that allowed behavior that would be unacceptable if their identities were known. This pressure valve function for young male energy was valuable to communities that otherwise maintained rigid social control. But it also reinforced specific ideas about masculinity, that real men are physically dominant, potentially threatening, and that their masculinity is expressed through the ability to intimidate and control space. Women, excluded from performing, were positioned as objects of this masculine performance. In many Krampus traditions, young women were preferred targets. Krampus pursued them specifically, touched them in ways that would be inappropriate outside the ritual context, frightened them in ways that demonstrated masculine dominance. This was framed as harmless fun, part of the festival's entertainment, but it also served to reinforce gender hierarchies, reminding women that public spaces were masculine domains, that their bodies could be touched and controlled by men, that their appropriate response to unwanted male attention was to laugh and accept, not resist or complain. Some women in traditional communities internalized these norms and willingly participated in the dynamic, seeing it as a harmless part of local culture. Others experienced it as uncomfortable or violating, but had few options to resist without being seen as killjoys or as rejecting community culture. This gender dimension of Krampus traditions is rarely discussed in contemporary celebrations or tourist representations. It's more comfortable to focus on picturesque aspects, the elaborate masks, the historical connections, the colorful folklore, than to examine how these practices functioned to reinforce gender inequalities. But in recent decades, as gender norms have changed in European societies, these dimensions have become increasingly visible and contested. Some women began demanding the right to perform as Krampus, challenging the masculine exclusivity of the tradition. Others began speaking publicly about uncomfortable or violating experiences during Krampus festivals, naming behaviors that were previously simply accepted as part of the tradition. Responses to these challenges varied. Some communities resisted fiercely, arguing that allowing women to perform as Krampus would violate the tradition's authenticity, that it would fundamentally change its character. Others began experimenting with gender inclusion, allowing women to participate as performers. These changes generated intense debates that go far beyond the specific question of who can wear a Krampus mask. They touch on deeper questions about whether traditions should be preserved in their historical forms, even when those forms reflect values that are no longer widely accepted, or whether traditions should evolve to reflect contemporary values about gender equality. There's no easy consensus. Defenders of masculine exclusivity argue that traditions lose their meaning when essential elements are changed, that not everything needs to be egalitarian, that there should be spaces for specifically masculine rituals. Advocates for inclusion argue that traditions that exclude half the population based on gender are unjust and should be reformed, that authenticity doesn't justify discrimination. Frau Perchta presents different but equally complex gender dynamics. While Krampus was performed by men and directed at everyone, Perchta was a feminine figure whose demands were directed specifically at women. She punished women who hadn't spun enough, who neglected domestic work, who violated norms of appropriate feminine behavior. Perchta then functioned as a gender policing mechanism, reinforcing that women should remain in domestic roles, that their value lay in reproductive work and household maintenance, that deviating from these expectations would bring punishment. She was invoked by men to control female behavior, but also by older women to socialize younger women into appropriate gender roles. This policing function was particularly important in societies where survival depended on rigid gender-based divisions of labor. When linen production was genuinely essential for family survival, and when this production was exclusively women's work, figures like Perchta served to ensure women fulfilled their obligations. But these same narratives also severely limited women's life options, punishing any deviation from narrowly defined roles. A woman who preferred other types of work, or who had talents in non-domestic areas, or who simply wasn't good at spinning, faced not just social disapproval, but also the ritualized threat embodied in figures like Perchta. And here's something particularly disturbing. The punishments Perchta supposedly inflicted were often specifically directed at female bodies and reproductive functions. Stories about Perchta opening bellies and filling them with straw can be read as metaphors about control of female bodies, about punishing women for failing to fulfill appropriate reproductive and domestic functions. These narratives existed in contexts where women had little bodily autonomy, where marriages were often arranged, where women's primary function was seen as reproduction and domestic maintenance. Figures like Perchta reinforced these expectations through visceral threats directed specifically at female bodies. In modern societies where women have gained significantly more autonomy and where gender roles are much less rigid, these dimensions of figures like Perchta have become deeply problematic. How do you celebrate or preserve a tradition that was fundamentally about controlling and limiting women? Some communities responded by simply letting Perchta traditions disappear. They're no longer told, no longer performed. They become historical curiosities, studied by folklorists but not lived by communities. Others tried to reinterpret Perchta, emphasizing aspects of rewarding hard work while minimizing punitive and gender-specific elements. But these reinterpretations often feel forced or dishonest, attempts to make historically problematic traditions palatable to modern sensibilities, removing precisely the elements that made them functional in their original contexts. The power dimensions of these traditions also extend beyond gender, to include age and social status. The dark figures reinforced age hierarchies, teaching children to respect and obey elders. They reinforced community conformity, punishing those who deviated from social norms. They maintained class structures, with elites often exempt from scrutiny, while the poor were preferred targets of moral judgment. In deeply hierarchical societies where social mobility was limited and where social order was seen as natural and divinely ordained, these functions were viewed as appropriate and necessary. But in modern democratic societies committed to equality and social mobility, they're deeply problematic. This creates a genuine dilemma. Can we separate the aspects of these traditions we consider valuable, recognition of duality, shadow integration, community rituals, connection to the past, from the aspects we consider problematic, reinforcement of gender hierarchies, oppressive social control, limitation of individual autonomy? Or are these dimensions so intertwined that attempting to preserve one necessarily preserves the other? And if so, does this mean these traditions should be completely abandoned? Or are there ways to transform them that maintain valuable elements while removing oppressive aspects? Different communities and individuals have reached different conclusions. There's no consensus, and probably can't be, because people have different values and prioritize different aspects of these complex traditions. What's clear is that contemporary celebrations of these traditions that completely ignore their gender and power dimensions are presenting sanitized and dishonest versions of history. They're choosing to focus on picturesque aspects while omitting uncomfortable realities about how these practices functioned to maintain inequalities. This doesn't necessarily mean the traditions should be abandoned, but it means they should be approached with honesty about their complete history, with recognition that they served both valuable and problematic functions, and with conscious reflection about which aspects are worth preserving and which should be transformed or left behind. As you reflect on these complex questions, allowing them to circulate in your mind as sleep approaches, consider: what traditions in your own life or culture carry hidden dimensions of power? How do practices that seem neutral or simply cultural actually function to maintain or challenge hierarchies? And how do you navigate the tension between honoring cultural heritage and living according to values of equality and justice. Because the story of gender and power dimensions in the dark figures of winter isn't just about specific European practices, it's about how all traditions exist within power structures, how culture and inequality often intertwine, and about the challenges of inheriting systems that are simultaneously meaningful and problematic. Something remarkable happened in the last 2 decades, traditions that seemed destined to disappear or remain obscure. Local curiosities experienced dramatic resurgences, not just in their regions of origin, but globally. Krampus, in particular, became an international phenomenon, appearing in places and contexts its original practitioners could never have imagined. Krampus festivals emerged in American, Australian, Canadian, and even Asian cities. The figure appeared in Hollywood films, television series, comic books, video games, and countless commercial products. This global resurgence raises fascinating questions about why certain traditions find new audiences at specific historical moments, how cultural practices travel and transform across borders, and what these new interpretations reveal about the needs and anxieties of contemporary societies. Have you ever wondered why Krampus, of all obscure folkloric figures, captured the global imagination in the early 21st century? Why not other equally interesting figures from European folklore? What is it specifically about Krampus that resonates with people living in modern, urban, technologically advanced societies that have little connection to the alpine agricultural realities that gave rise to the figure? Part of the answer lies in timing. Krampus's resurgence coincided with several broader cultural trends that created fertile conditions for his appeal. There was growing disenchantment with commercialized Christmas, a sense among many people that the celebration had become hollow, overly commercial, disconnected from any deeper meaning. Krampus offered an alternative, a way to celebrate the winter season that felt more authentic, more connected to historical roots, more honest about the complexity of human experience. There was also growing interest in Gothic subcultures, horror, and dark aesthetics. For people attracted to these sensibilities, Krampus was perfect, a genuinely scary figure with legitimate historical credentials, not just another monster invented by Hollywood. He offered a way to express countercultural identity while also connecting to real cultural traditions. The internet played a crucial role in Krampus's resurgence. Before the digital era, knowledge about obscure Krampus traditions was largely limited to alpine regions and specialized academics. But with the internet, images of Krampus festivals, documentaries, articles, and discussions became instantly accessible globally. People in Los Angeles or Sydney could learn about Krampus, watch videos of Krampuslauf, and decide to create their own versions of the tradition, all without ever visiting the Alps. This democratization of access to cultural information fundamentally transformed how traditions spread. Historically, cultural practices traveled slowly, carried by immigrants or transmitted through prolonged contact between communities. Now they can spread virally, adopted by people who have no historical or geographic connection to their origins. But what exactly is being adopted when urban Americans organize Krampus festivals? Are they preserving alpine traditions or creating something completely new that merely uses alpine elements as inspiration? The answer is clearly the latter. Krampus festivals that emerged in American cities are fundamentally different from traditional Krampuslauf in alpine villages. They happen in urban contexts, not rural ones. They're organized through social media and interest groups, not through long-standing community structures. They attract participants from diverse backgrounds who share interest in Krampus, not members of homogeneous communities with generations of shared history. The meanings are also different. For traditional alpine participants, Krampus is connected to local identity, family heritage, seasonal rhythms of agricultural life, and layers of cultural meaning accumulated over centuries. For urban American participants, Krampus is often about countercultural expression, critique of consumerism, aesthetic appreciation of the macabre, or simply fun and community around an unusual shared interest. Neither of these meanings is inherently more valid than the other, but they are different, and recognizing these differences is important for understanding what's really happening in Krampus's global resurgence. Some observers see this resurgence as cultural appropriation, outsiders taking elements from a culture that isn't theirs, removing them from context, and using them for their own purposes without adequate understanding or respect for the origins. Others see it as natural cultural evolution. Traditions have always traveled, always been adapted by new practitioners, always been transformed in the process. Both perspectives have merit. It's true that many participants in urban Krampus festivals have superficial understanding of the Alpine traditions they're ostensibly celebrating. It's also true that culture has always functioned through borrowing, adaptation, and transformation, and that trying to freeze traditions in authentic forms is fighting against the fundamental nature of how culture operates. Perhaps the more important question isn't whether global resurgence is appropriation or evolution, but whether it's happening in ways that are respectful and conscious, or in ways that are exploitative and ignorant. Are urban Krampus participants making efforts to learn about historical and cultural contexts? Are they acknowledging they're creating something new rather than claiming they're preserving authentic traditions? Are they supporting Alpine communities that maintain traditional practices, perhaps by purchasing masks from traditional craftsmen instead of mass-produced products? When these things happen, global resurgence can actually benefit traditional communities, creating new markets for traditional craftsmanship, raising awareness about cultural practices that might otherwise disappear, and creating networks of interested people who can support preservation efforts. But when resurgence happens purely as consumption, people buying mass-produced Krampus-themed products, watching Hollywood films that use Krampus as just another generic monster, attending themed parties that have no connection to real traditions, then traditional communities don't benefit, and the tradition is reduced to just another commercial product. Krampus's resurgence has also generated new, creative interpretations that transform the figure in ways its original creators never imagined. Contemporary artists have created works using Krampus imagery to comment on politics, society, environmental issues. Writers have used Krampus as a vehicle to explore themes of justice, consequence, and the nature of good and evil. Activists have even used Krampus as a symbol in protests representing consequences for those in power who abuse their positions. These creative reinterpretations demonstrate the flexibility of powerful cultural symbols. Krampus isn't confined to specific historical meanings. He can be reimagined, reinterpreted, invested with new meanings that speak to contemporary concerns. This is living culture, not museum preservation, but these transformations also raise questions about how far a figure can be transformed before it loses connection to what made it meaningful in the first place. When Krampus becomes a generic political symbol or pop culture icon, something essential is lost: the specific layers of cultural meaning that accumulated over centuries in Alpine contexts. Perhaps the answer is that multiple versions of Krampus can coexist. Traditional Alpine Krampus can continue existing in communities that have maintained him for generations. Urban American Krampus can exist as a related but distinct creation. Krampus as artistic or political symbol can exist as another variation. Each serves different purposes, speaks to different audiences, carries different meanings. This multiplicity may be uncomfortable for those who want clear categories and definitive definitions. But it may be more honest about how culture actually works, not as pure and distinct categories, but as overlapping networks of practice, meaning, and identity that are constantly in flux. Global resurgence is also happening with figures beyond Krampus. The Icelandic Yule Lads have gained international attention. Frau Perchta is being rediscovered by people interested in feminine folklore and witchcraft. Belsnickel has experienced renewed interest in German-American communities and beyond. Each of these figures is being transformed in the process of global resurgence, invested with new meanings, adapted to new contexts. And each of these transformations generates debates about authenticity, appropriation, and the nature of tradition. These debates are healthy and necessary. They force conscious reflection about what we're doing when we adopt cultural practices, about our responsibilities to the communities where these practices originated, and about how to balance preservation with innovation. But these debates can also become paralyzing if we insist on impossible purity or absolute authenticity. Culture has always been hybrid, always been borrowed and transformed. The question isn't whether we should allow this to happen, we can't prevent it, but how we can make it happen in ways that are respectful, conscious, and mutually beneficial. The global resurgence of dark winter figures also reveals something about contemporary needs that aren't being met by dominant cultural narratives. There's clearly a hunger for stories that acknowledge complexity, that allow space for darkness and shadow, that offer alternatives to toxic positivity and empty consumerism. These figures, with their roots in pre-modern eras when life was harder but perhaps in some ways more honest about its difficulties, offer something that resonates with people living in modern societies that often seem disconnected from fundamental realities of human existence. They remind us that not everything is light, that consequences exist, that the world isn't infinitely malleable to our desires, that there are forces, whether nature, society, or aspects of ourselves, that we can't simply control or eliminate through positive thinking or consumption. These are messages many contemporary people need to hear, even if they don't articulate them in these terms. And the resurgence of these figures suggests there's a real appetite for narratives that offer these perspectives. As you contemplate these ideas, allowing them to move through your consciousness as sleep approaches, consider what traditions or practices from other cultures or eras have you adopted in your own life? How have you transformed them in the process? And how do you balance appreciation and learning from cultures beyond your own with respect for their origins and context? Because the story of the global resurgence of dark winter figures isn't just about specific folklore. It's about how culture moves through a globalized world, about how we create meaning in societies characterized by diversity and rapid change, and about our responsibility to engage with cultural heritages in ways that are both creative and respectful. After exploring the pagan origins, Christian transformations, pedagogical functions, modern controversies, and global resurgence of the dark figures of winter, we arrive at an essential question. What can these centuries-old traditions teach us about our own time? And how can we apply the wisdom embodied in these practices, even when we recognize their problematic aspects, to the challenges we face in raising the next generation and building meaningful communities in the 21st century? These aren't abstract academic questions. They touch on practical dilemmas that parents, educators, and communities face daily. How do we teach responsibility in an age of instant gratification? How do we prepare children for a world that will inevitably contain difficulties without unnecessarily traumatizing them? How do we create meaningful rituals and traditions in societies characterized by diversity and rapid change? How do we balance protection with preparation, comfort with challenge? Have you ever wondered why so many contemporary parents feel they're failing to transmit values of responsibility and resilience despite having access to more educational resources and psychological knowledge than any previous generation? Why, in an era of unprecedented material abundance, do so many children seem less prepared to handle adversity than children from previous generations who grew up with far less? The dark figures of winter, with all their complexity and contradictions, offer some provocative answers to these questions. Not because we should simply replicate medieval practices in modern contexts, that would be absurd and inappropriate, but because these traditions embody principles about human development and cultural transmission that remain relevant, even when the specific forms must be radically transformed. The first principle is the importance of duality. European traditions that maintained both reward and consequence figures recognized something fundamental. Meaning is created through contrast. Gifts mean more when you know you might not receive them. Protection is valued when you understand it's not guaranteed. Positive behavior has meaning when negative behavior has real consequences. Modern America, with its universally benevolent Santa Claus and guaranteed gifts for all children, eliminated this contrast. The result is a celebration that's materially abundant, but often emotionally empty. Children receive piles of presents, but often seem bored or unsatisfied. Parents spend fortunes, but feel something essential is missing. This doesn't mean we should literally import Krampus to terrorize American children, but it suggests there's value in creating structures where reward isn't automatic, where consequences exist, where children learn that their actions matter, and that not all outcomes are equally positive. This could take many forms in modern contexts. It could mean establishing clear expectations about behavior and linking celebrations or gifts to meeting those expectations. It could mean creating family rituals where children reflect on their year's behavior, identify areas for growth, and make commitments for the next year. It could mean balancing messages about unconditional love with recognition that behavior has consequences and that not all choices are equally valid. The second principle is the value of ritualized and controlled fear. The dark figures offered children opportunities to encounter and master fears in safe and predictable contexts. This served important functions in developing resilience and coping skills. The contemporary tendency to protect children from all discomfort or fear may be well-intentioned, but it may inadvertently leave them poorly prepared for a world that will inevitably contain challenges. Research on what psychologists call helicopter parenting, or lawnmower parenting, where parents constantly intervene to remove obstacles and protect children from all difficulty, shows this can impair development of resilience, problem-solving, and ability to handle adversity. Again, this doesn't mean we should deliberately traumatize children, but it suggests there's value in allowing children to experience age-appropriate challenges, in not rushing to solve all problems for them, in letting them experience natural consequences of choices, and in creating opportunities for them to practice courage and perseverance. This could mean allowing children to experience disappointment when they don't achieve goals, rather than always ensuring everyone wins. It could mean letting them navigate social conflicts without constant adult intervention. It could mean exposing them to stories and experiences that contain age-appropriate elements of challenge or fear, rather than completely sanitizing their media and experiences. The third principle is the importance of community rituals. The dark figures weren't just about individual families, they were about entire communities gathering to reaffirm shared values, create collective experiences, and link generations through shared practices. Modern America is characterized by community fragmentation. Many people barely know their neighbors. Extended families often live separated by large distances. Traditional institutions that created community, churches, civic organizations, social clubs, have declined in participation. The result is widespread isolation and loss of the community connections that historically provided support, meaning, and identity. Recreating meaningful community rituals in modern contexts is challenging, but not impossible. It could mean creating neighborhood traditions, annual celebrations, shared projects, seasonal rituals that bring people together regularly. It could mean revitalizing or creating new rites of passage that mark important transitions and are recognized by the community. It could mean finding ways to link generations, creating opportunities for elders to transmit wisdom and for youth to contribute energy and fresh perspectives. The fourth principle is recognition that traditions must evolve to remain relevant. The dark figures survived for centuries not because they remained frozen in immutable forms, but because they were constantly adapted to changing contexts. When material conditions changed, when social values evolved, when new needs emerged, the traditions transformed. This offers an important lesson for how we think about cultural preservation and tradition creation. Traditions aren't fragile artifacts that must be protected from all change. They're living practices that must be actively reimagined by each generation. The question isn't how do we preserve traditions exactly as they were, but how do we transform traditions so they continue serving meaningful functions in changing contexts? This could mean taking elements from historical traditions that resonate, but radically adapting them for contemporary contexts. It could mean creating completely new traditions that serve similar functions to those historical traditions served. It could mean being willing to let go of aspects of traditions that are no longer functional or that contradict contemporary values, while maintaining elements that still speak to fundamental human needs. The fifth principle is the importance of honesty about complexity. The dark figures didn't offer simplified narratives about the world. They acknowledged that life contains both light and darkness, both reward and consequence, both protection and danger. They didn't try to hide these realities from children, but presented them in ways that were processable and meaningful. The contemporary tendency to present children with overly simplified and sanitized versions of reality can be counterproductive. Children aren't as fragile as we often assume. They're capable of handling complexity and ambiguity when presented in age-appropriate ways. And protecting them from all exposure to difficult aspects of reality can leave them poorly prepared when they inevitably encounter these realities later. This could mean having honest conversations with children about difficult topics, injustice, suffering, death, failure, in age-appropriate ways. It could mean not always providing happy endings or easy answers. It could mean modeling how to handle difficulty and ambiguity rather than pretending they don't exist. But applying these principles requires careful navigation. The dark figures also embodied aspects we recognize as problematic: reinforcement of gender hierarchies, oppressive social control, use of fear in ways that could be genuinely harmful. We can't simply replicate historical practices without critical thought about which elements are worth preserving and which should be transformed or abandoned. This requires what we might call critical engagement with tradition. Neither total rejection nor uncritical acceptance, but careful analysis of what functions traditions served, which of those functions remain important, and how we can serve those functions in ways that align with contemporary values. For example, we can value the principle that behavior has consequences without replicating punishments that were excessively harsh or that reinforced inequalities. We can create rituals of transition to adulthood without limiting participation based on gender. We can recognize the importance of confronting fears without exposing children to genuinely traumatic experiences. This kind of critical engagement requires reflection, experimentation, and willingness to adjust when something isn't working. There are no simple formulas or universal solutions. What works for one family or community may not work for another. Context matters. Individual needs matter. Cultural values matter. But the process of engagement itself, of asking questions about what we want to transmit to the next generation, about how we create meaning and community, about how we balance continuity with change, is valuable regardless of the specific answers we reach. The dark figures of winter, then, offer not definitive answers, but productive questions. They invite us to reflect on what we've lost in modernization, on which fundamental human needs remain constant even when contexts change dramatically, and on how we can create contemporary practices that serve those needs in ways that are both effective and ethical. They remind us that our ancestors, despite having far less scientific knowledge and material resources, developed sophisticated wisdom about human development, community cohesion, and cultural transmission. This wisdom was embodied not in theoretical texts, but in lived practices, rituals, stories, traditions that worked even when those practicing them couldn't fully articulate why they worked. We can't simply return to these practices, but we can learn from them, extract principles, and reimagine them for our own contexts. We can ask, what did these traditions do that was valuable? What needs did they meet? And how can we meet those same needs in ways appropriate for our own time? As you reflect on these questions, allowing them to settle into your consciousness as sleep approaches, consider which principles from the dark figures resonate with you. Which aspects of their embodied wisdom could be adapted for your own life, family, or community? And how can you balance learning from the past with creating practices that serve the needs of the present and future? Because the story of the dark figures of winter isn't just about the past. It's about the ongoing quest for how to live well, how to raise the next generation with wisdom, how to build communities that sustain and give meaning, and how to navigate the permanent tension between honoring what came before and creating what doesn't yet exist. We've reached the end of our journey through the shadows of European winter, through centuries of traditions that recognize something our modern age often forgets: that human life is lived not only in light, but also in darkness, and that both are necessary to create meaning, depth, and wisdom. The figures we've explored, Krampus with his chains and horns, Perchta with her relentless demands, the Yule Lads with their specific mischief, Belsnickel with his tests of honesty, weren't simply monsters created to frighten children. They were sophisticated expressions of profound psychological and social truths, embodied in forms that could be transmitted through generations, that could be lived and experienced, rather than merely understood intellectually. They taught us that consequences exist, that not everyone deserves reward, that the world operates according to laws that don't bend to our desires, that protection must be earned through correct behavior, that community survives through cooperation and shared responsibility. These weren't abstract lessons taught in classrooms, but visceral truths embodied in experiences that engaged emotions, body, and imagination. And perhaps most importantly, these figures taught us about integration. It's about the need to recognize and accept both light and shadow, both in ourselves and in the world. They said, don't pretend only goodness exists. Don't deny the difficult aspects of reality. Acknowledge them, name them, ritualize them, and thus keep them within manageable bounds. This wisdom about integration may be the most valuable contribution these ancient traditions offer our time. We live in an era characterized by extremes. Political polarization where each side sees the other as purely evil. Social media culture that presents perfectly curated lives while hiding real struggles. Toxic positivity that insists we must always be happy and grateful. Simplified narratives that reduce complexity to binaries of good and bad. In this context, the dark figures of winter offer a necessary corrective. They remind us that reality is more complex than our comfortable categories allow, that people and situations contain both light and shadow, that wisdom lies not in denying one side or the other, but in integrating both into a more complete understanding. They invite us to ask questions our culture often avoids. What happens when we eliminate all elements of challenge, consequence, and darkness from our celebrations and narratives? When we create environments where children never experience disappointment, where everyone always receives trophies, where gifts are guaranteed regardless of behavior. When we build identities based only on positive aspects of ourselves while denying or repressing qualities we consider unacceptable. The answer suggested by the dark figure traditions is that we lose something essential: depth, resilience, the ability to handle the complete reality of human existence. We create shiny superficiality that crumbles when it encounters real difficulty. We build sandcastles of positivity that are swept away by the first wave of genuine adversity. But recognizing the value of these traditions doesn't mean uncritically accepting all their aspects. As we've explored throughout this journey, these practices also embodied elements we recognize as problematic: reinforcement of gender hierarchies, oppressive social control, use of fear in ways that could be genuinely harmful, perpetuation of inequalities. The task, then, isn't simply to replicate historical practices, but to extract fundamental principles and reimagine them for our own contexts. We can value recognition of duality without replicating excessive punishments. We can create meaningful rituals without reinforcing inequalities. We can teach about consequences without traumatizing. We can integrate shadow without being oppressive. This requires what we might call adaptive wisdom, the ability to learn from the past without being imprisoned by it, to honor tradition while remaining committed to contemporary values of equality and justice, to maintain continuity while embracing necessary change. It's a delicate balance, and there are no simple formulas for achieving it. Different people and communities will reach different conclusions about where this balance should be, and that's appropriate. Diversity of approaches reflects diversity of contexts, values, and needs. But the process of engaging with these questions is itself valuable. It forces us to articulate what we truly value, what we want to transmit to the next generation, what kind of communities we want to build, how we want to live in a world that contains both beauty and terror, both joy and suffering. The dark figures of winter also teach us about the nature of tradition itself. They demonstrate that traditions aren't static artifacts of the past, but living processes that must be constantly reimagined. Each generation doesn't inherit ready-made traditions. It inherits cultural raw material that must be actively transformed to make sense in its own context. This understanding frees us both from the obligation to preserve traditions in historical forms that no longer serve useful purposes, and from the presumption that we must completely reject the past and start from scratch. We can be simultaneously conservative and innovative, honoring what came before while creating what doesn't yet exist. It also frees us from the impossible quest for pure authenticity. There's no true version of Krampus or any other cultural tradition. There are only layers of interpretation and practice that have accumulated over time, each authentic in its own context, each transforming what came before. When we participate in these traditions today, whether in alpine villages maintaining practices from generations past, or in American cities creating new interpretations, or simply reflecting on what they mean, we're adding our own layer to this ongoing process of cultural transformation. We're not preserving the past, we're creating the present in ways that maintain connection to the past. And perhaps that's what traditions really do. Did not bind us to the past, but connect us to something larger than ourselves, to a stream of meaning that extends through generations, that reminds us we're not the first to face these challenges, that our ancestors developed wisdom that still has value, even when specific forms must change. As you prepare for sleep, letting these reflections settle into your consciousness, consider what you take from this journey through winter's shadows. Perhaps it's a renewed appreciation for complexity, a recognition that important questions rarely have simple answers, that both light and shadow have their places, that wisdom lies in integration rather than denial. Perhaps it's a deeper understanding of your own traditions. seeing them not as fixed practices that must be preserved or entirely rejected, but as living processes you have both responsibility and authority to consciously transform. Perhaps it's a commitment to create rituals and practices in your own life that acknowledge the totality of human experience, that celebrate joy but also recognize difficulty, that offer comfort but also prepare for challenge, that build community through shared experiences that have depth and real meaning. Or perhaps it's simply a sense of connection with people in alpine villages who still perform centuries-old rituals, with ancestors who develop these practices in response to challenges we can no longer fully imagine, with others around the world who are asking the same questions about how to live well, how to create meaning, how to transmit wisdom through generations. The dark figures of winter teach us we're not alone in these quests. They're fundamental human questions that transcend specific culture and era, and while answers must be constantly reimagined for new contexts, the quest itself connects us across time and space. So as night's darkness envelops you as you move towards sleep and dreams, carry with you this final truth the dark figures embody. That darkness is not the enemy of light, but its necessary partner. That shadow is not something to be denied or eliminated, but integrated and understood. That the totality of human experience, with all its contradictions, complexities, and mysteries, is what makes life rich, meaningful, and profoundly human. May you sleep well knowing that both light and shadow have their places, that both joy and challenge shape who we become, and that wisdom lies not in choosing one over the other, but in embracing the dance between both that defines the human condition. Good night. May your dreams be rich with the complexities that make life worth living, and may you wake renewed, ready to engage with both the light and shadow that each new day brings.